Nightmare with the delivery person. I am one of those people who hates ordering food over the phone. My kids always criticize me and call me old-fashioned because rain, thunder, or snow, whenever we order food, I always drive straight to the restaurant. What they don't know is that this isn't just a whim. It's a story that's not exactly a pleasant one. I was 12 years old, and it was one of the first times I was allowed to stay home alone. My parents had gone to a friend's party a few blocks away and decided I was old enough to take care of myself. I was thrilled because I could stay home alone and sleep whenever I wanted. That night, I was allowed to order a pizza by myself. At first, my parents waited for the delivery guy, but he was taking too long, so they had to leave. Seeing how excited I was, they left me some money and headed out. As soon as they left, I turned on the TV and cranked up the volume. I knew it would be a long night, so I took the dog out to the backyard. After my parents left, he finally arrived, very late. I heard the sound of a motorcycle stopping outside my house. I stood up and walked toward the door. Maybe the pizza guy had finally arrived. I opened the door and saw a tall, skinny man with a scruffy, bushy beard holding a pizza box. He looked at me with a strange, almost unsettling expression. At that moment, I was hungry and feeling a little uneasy, so I said,
"You're late."
The man stared at me and said,
"Hey kid, what's your problem?"
I started to feel weird about his behavior. He seemed almost angry, and his body language became more aggressive. At that moment, I got scared and just wanted to avoid anything bad happening. I quickly handed him the money and grabbed the pizza box from his hands. I apologized and quickly closed the door. I was so scared I nearly slammed it shut. But it didn't stop there. Things got worse. He didn't leave but stood there, almost shouting through the front door.
"Hey kid, what are you doing? I haven't even counted the money."
All the money is there.
I cried and apologized. At that point, I just begged him to leave and take all the money. There was silence for a moment, but then the man started yelling again, demanding a tip. He lost control, banging on the door with his fists and kicking it when I didn't respond. After a few seconds, just as suddenly as it started, he seemed to get bored and left. My first instinct was to slowly creep toward the door and peek out the nearby window to check if he was really gone. But as I did so, his face suddenly appeared right in front of me, twisted into a crooked smile, and in his hand, he was holding something. When I realized he was holding a baseball bat, I panicked, frantically hiding under the bed, hoping he wouldn't find me. Meanwhile, he pounded on the door with the baseball bat, and after a few strikes at the lock, the door burst open and he entered my house. He went straight to the wardrobe, where I almost hid, and began smashing it violently. If I had hidden there, my entire body would have been destroyed. He left the room and headed straight for the backyard, suspecting I might escape there. My dog immediately attacked him, but at that moment, I heard my dog whimper. I realized something had happened to him, and I couldn't hold back the overwhelming sadness. He moved like a shadow, storming toward where I was hiding, his face twisted in anger.
"Where are you, kid? I know you're hiding somewhere."
He yanked the mattress away and began smashing the bed with the bat, as if trying to break the wood and leave me trapped beneath the wreckage. The wood of the bed began to splinter, and the shards dug into my skin. All I could do was scream for help. As if answering my prayers, two of my neighbors burst in from behind and tackled him to the floor. He quickly got back up, grabbing the bat and trying to swing at them, but one of the neighbors managed to wrestle it away. Then he fled immediately. Suddenly, everything went white and I passed out. When I woke up, I found myself in the hospital. My parents were crying in front of me, saying I was lucky to have only minor injuries. I accidentally overheard my parents talking about the man. He had been a convict with a history of violence, and that night, he had fought with a couple and argued with his boss. In the years that followed, I never ordered delivery again after what happened. Home alone and an uninvited guest. George lived alone in her house in a small Michigan town on weekends. She often came here to escape the urban lifestyle she had grown up in and had grown tired of. She enjoyed the peaceful countryside, but George's house was like something out of a horror movie, an old house with overgrown grass and peeling paint. One Friday, George had just arrived home. She sat on the couch, her eyes glued to the TV, relaxing after a long week at work. As she flipped through channels, her peace was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. At first, George ignored it, thinking it wasn't important. But the knocking grew louder and more persistent. George opened the door and saw a man standing there, holding a clipboard. She immediately assumed he was selling something. He asked her if she was satisfied with her security system. George replied that she didn't have one but wasn't too concerned, joking that no one would break into such an ugly house. He then went on to describe all the recent break-ins in the area, which, honestly, George had never heard of. He then asked who George lived with, and she accidentally blurted out that she lived alone. Although she wasn't interested, he persistently asked for her phone number at least. He said he'd follow up in a few weeks and even offered free installation on the spot. After some back and forth, George agreed since it sounded like a good deal. He thanked her and left. Later, George went to the kitchen to start cooking dinner and then continued watching movies in the living room. She binge-watched for hours on the couch until around 11 p.m. when there was a knock at the door. This time, it was hard to ignore. George glanced at the clock, worried. 11 p.m. was far too late for anyone to knock on the door, especially since she wasn't close with her neighbors. The knocking persisted. She cautiously approached the door and asked who was there, but there was no response. Thinking quickly, she lied that she had a gun, though she didn't. She hoped it would scare them off. For a moment, the knocking stopped, but then her phone rang. When she answered, the voice on the other end claimed to be from 911, saying there was a dangerous intruder in her house, and they needed to come in to handle him. They said they were standing at her door, but she was skeptical. George looked around and saw nothing unusual. Meanwhile, the knocking outside continued relentlessly. She unlocked one of the latches and hesitantly placed her hand on the doorknob. But before she could react, the door somehow opened. It wasn't a police officer like the caller claimed. It was him, the delivery man from earlier. His demeanor was erratic and strange, his eyes wide, no longer resembling a salesperson. Then he said,
"You shouldn't let yourself be tricked like that. Your house really is run down, but to let your guard down like this? I think you need me."
He smiled cheerfully, as if nothing had happened before. George had no idea what the hell was going on. He started telling her that his car had broken down, and he asked for a cup of hot water, saying he'd leave right after. But his expression was off. It was bad enough that she really thought he might be a burglar. Reluctantly, she went to get the water while he sat waiting in the living room. After finishing the water, he left, thanking her for the drink. She sighed in relief and moved to close the door. But as she tried to close it, his arm blocked it. A strong shove flung the door back open. She asked,
Did you forget something? Don't joke like that.
but no, he was slowly advancing, grinning maliciously. Instinctively, George backed away and ran into the kitchen. He chased her into the kitchen, laughing gleefully.
You should have been more careful. Watching you scared is so entertaining.
Then he immediately went to the knife rack and grabbed one. He swung it through the air, narrowly missing, but it grazed her sleeve, leaving George injured and in pain. Panicked, unsure of what he wanted, she ran to the front door. But when she got there, George tripped and fell while he stood over her, knife in hand. Then her eyes caught sight of a mini fire extinguisher near the door. She grabbed it and sprayed it into his face, disorienting him. She grabbed the keys hanging nearby, ran outside, got into her car, and sped off in terror. Once she reached a safe distance, she called the real police to track him down. He was eventually apprehended, and it turned out the man wasn't a random intruder, but someone who had been stalking her. He had faked the 911 call, knowing she would open the door. That night would stay with her forever, but she remained grateful to be alive. George swore to herself that no one would ever trick her into opening the door again. The terror on Christmas Eve. This incident happened on Christmas Eve, the year Lena was 13. Since she only lived with her dad, and her family usually either didn't celebrate or celebrated Christmas late, she was used to this. For Lena, Christmas Eve was just like any other night. Her dad was a doctor, so he always had to be on call at the hospital during Christmas holidays. That night was no exception. He wasn't home. Lena was watching TV when she heard a knock at the door, so she went to see who it was. Her front door had a peephole, making it easy to see who was outside. A man stood outside wearing a Santa Claus suit, holding a bag and smiling, waving at Lena to open the door. But something about him seemed off. He didn't look neat at all. Lena approached the door, but didn't open it. She found it odd that someone dressed as Santa Claus would come to her house, of all the houses in the neighborhood. He said,
"Hey kid, it's me, Santa Claus. Let me in, and I'll show you."
Maybe other kids would believe him, but Lena knew he wasn't real. Confused and skeptical, because this had never happened before, Lena refused to open the door. The man insisted, saying he had changed the rules this year to give gifts to kids in the neighborhood. But Lena didn't believe him. Instead, she remembered feeling angry while arguing with him. Lena told him she was calling the police. His smile disappeared, and after that, she didn't hear anything else. To be sure, Lena called the police to report him. Unfortunately, they probably didn't believe her and thought she was just an excited kid, hoping Santa Claus would visit. She only knew how to dial 911 and the house number, since it was the 90s and her dad didn't have a mobile phone yet. Lena could only hope the man wouldn't return. But a few minutes later, someone knocked again. When Lena checked, no one was there. She returned to the Christmas tree to continue decorating and wrapping gifts as a surprise for her dad. Lena turned on the TV to watch Christmas specials, which made her feel less lonely. Suddenly, the power went out, leaving the house in darkness. Lena jumped in fright. Now, the only light in the house came from the battery-operated Christmas tree. Then she heard the back door creak open. From the doorway emerged a dark silhouette, slowly advancing. It was the figure of a man. Lena grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer and shone it towards the figure. The face revealed was his, the man from earlier, leaning close to her with a sinister grin.
"Here's your surprise gift, little one,"
he sneered. Lena screamed and ran toward the back door, but she couldn't outrun him. He grabbed her hand and yanked her back. Lena sobbed and screamed, begging for mercy, but he showed no remorse. He taped her mouth shut and began tying her up with rope. As her vision blurred, he stuffed her into a large sack he had brought with him and hoisted it over his shoulder. Lena's next-door neighbor, who was walking his dog, happened to see the man. His actions seemed suspicious. The neighbor remembered that Lena lived alone with her father, who was often away, and her father had occasionally asked him to check on her. He cautiously approached with his dog and asked,
What are you doing out here at this hour? Is everything okay?
The man, startled, quickly forced a smile and replied,
Oh, I'm just preparing a surprise for the kids in the neighborhood.
The man hurriedly hid the sack behind his back, stepping away as his eyes darted around. His strange behavior only heightened the neighbor's suspicions. His dog kept barking, as if trying to warn him of something. It was a smart dog, good at sensing trouble. The neighbor noticed the sack behind the man seemed to be moving slightly. Sensing the man was odd, the neighbor remained cautious. He apologized for bothering him and pretended to head back toward his house. He then heard a faint sound resembling crying and immediately knew something was wrong. Without thinking, he rushed toward the man and shoved him hard, causing him to fall onto the grass. The sack fell, and Lena tumbled out onto the grass, her eyes wide with terror. The man tried to flee, but the neighbor quickly pinned him to the ground and held him there until the police arrived. The man remained on the ground, handcuffed and arrested. Lena was safely escorted back home by her neighbor. Her father returned home immediately after hearing the news. That night, Lena learned the true meaning of fear. She hugged her father tightly, knowing she was lucky to have survived a terrifying Christmas Eve. The Madman at the Cinema. On a cold evening, Beth stood in the staff room, scrolling through her phone as the night shift neared its end. It was a late shift, one of those nights that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a small, slightly run-down cinema with just one screen. Snow was falling heavier outside, and she was eager to get home after a long night of cleaning. As she texted her mother to let her know she was okay, the door creaked open, and her manager, Mr. Miller, walked in. Mr. Miller spoke in his usual tone.
Don't forget to lock the back door after you're done. I'll have William pick up the keys for tomorrow's shift. Also, check if the toilet's leaking before you leave.
Beth sighed, not thrilled about the last-minute request. She nodded and bid her manager goodbye before he left her to finish her tasks. Beth worked as part of the cleaning crew, but the cinema felt eerily empty after the final screening ended. As Beth walked down the rows of seats, sweeping up popcorn and other debris, a chill ran down her spine. Something about the atmosphere tonight felt different, though she couldn't put her finger on it. Beth's phone buzzed, and she picked it up. It was her mom, worried about her working the night shift again, and saying it wasn't safe. Beth began reassuring her. Beth hung up. With a sigh, she turned on some music on her phone and placed it on one of the red seats in the theater as she continued cleaning. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a faint sound, almost like glass shattering. It came from the emergency exit. Beth called out,
Who's there?
but no one answered. She stopped the music and started toward the emergency exit, which opened to reveal a long hallway with flickering lights.
Is anyone out there? Hello?
She continued walking, then froze in front of a shattered window. Glass lay scattered on the floor, along with a large rock that someone had likely thrown from outside. She wasn't alone. Beth instinctively reached into her pocket for her phone, but then she remembered it was still on the seat in the theater. She hesitated. Should she go back for it? But things were becoming more complicated. Without wasting another second, Beth hurried back to the theater. As she rounded the corner, Beth froze. Standing at the end of the hallway was a shadowy figure. He had his back to her, swaying unnaturally, like someone who had lost control. His clothes were disheveled, and his hair was a mess. Beth tried to quietly sneak away, but then he turned around, her stomach sinking as she froze in place. The light illuminated his horrifying face. He wore a sinister grin, like a grotesque mask, a mix of burns and hollow, bloodshot, crazed eyes. As she faced him, he revealed his dark intentions, saying,
I've been waiting for you. I will have you.
Beth stumbled back toward the theater as the man began chasing her, laughing and running like a madman. When she reached the seat where her phone lay, she grabbed it and ran deeper into the theater, hiding behind the rows of seats. Her hand reached for a mop nearby, ready to defend herself. Beth tried to call the police, but before she could speak, the emergency exit door burst open, and the man lunged in with a chilling, raspy laugh. She dared not breathe or move, but then she felt breathing above her head, freezing her in place. He suddenly appeared behind the seat, laughing in amusement.
You can't hide forever, Beth. I can hear your little heart racing.
Terrified, Beth ran, instinctively grabbing anything she could and hurling it at him to slow him down, throwing him off balance. Beth quietly crawled under the seats, making her way toward the exit. She was almost there and bolted for the door, but he noticed her movement at the last second and lunged at her. His icy hand grabbed Beth's hair. He yanked her back violently, causing her immense pain. Beth screamed, kicking with all her strength. Desperation surged within her as she grabbed a sharp piece of debris. She stabbed his hand, leaving a deep gash. He howled in pain, letting her go just long enough for Beth to get up and run toward the exit. She slammed the door shut, locking it and blocking it with a stick, despite his screams and pounding.
I'll be back. I'll find you.
She ran outside, barely noticing the cold, trembling as she called for help. Later, the police revealed that the man had been stalking Beth for weeks, even poisoning her cat to cause her grief. Beth was horrified. She had never known the man, but he had inserted himself into her life without her knowledge for a long time. Beth survived, but her life was forever changed. She was in shock, undergoing therapy, and eventually moved in with her sister. The obsession with the forgotten hospital. My girlfriend and I are passionate about road trips, but things wouldn't have taken a turn for the worse if our passion had stayed within its limits. On a rainy day, Stella and I were on our way back from a road trip. The rain grew heavier, and driving became challenging amidst the storm, so we decided to pull over on the highway shoulder. I worried that waiting on the highway during a storm wasn't a safe choice. I was pondering what to do next when Stella said,
Look, Mark.
"There's a building at the left, turn up ahead." I followed her gaze and saw a structure peeking out from behind the trees at some distance. Stella said,
Let's go there. We might find shelter for the night.
At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I realized it was an abandoned hospital. We got out of the car and ran inside. The large glass door at the entrance was shattered. As we stepped into the hospital, I realized no one had been here in ages. Furniture was broken, and shards of glass were scattered everywhere. Rain seeped through the damp ceiling and dripped onto the floor. The sound of water droplets mixed with the creak of rust. The wind howled through broken windows, creating an eerie atmosphere. Stella whispered, "This feels like an adventure." Stella was a horror writer, so an eerie setting like this excited her. We'd explored many abandoned places for her creative inspiration. I chuckled and said, "Let's look around. Who knows, you might find a story here." If I'd known my joke would turn into a nightmare, I would have left right then. Stella and I began exploring the place, turning on our phone flashlights. To the left was a hallway, lined with several rooms. We entered the hallway and opened the first room. Inside was an old, dirty bed. Near the bed were a table and a chair. What caught my attention was the safety straps attached to the bed handles. I'd never seen hospital beds this strange before. Most of the rooms were like this. After a while, Stella grew bored and said there was nothing to see here and suggested going upstairs. We climbed the stairs, cobwebs and dust everywhere. The hallway upstairs was littered with broken glass and damp clothes scattered everywhere. When I shone my flashlight on the walls, I saw disturbing drawings, demonic faces etched onto the walls. Someone had even written, "You will not escape." I felt uneasy seeing all this and told Stella, maybe we should wait in the car. The rain will stop eventually. Stella teased and mocked me. At the end of the hallway, there was a large door with the words "Surgery Department" on it. Stella was looking at the graffiti on the wall. I asked her, "What do you think happened here?" Stella smiled and said it was just a surgery room. I pushed the door open with annoyance, and with a terrible creaking sound, it opened. I've never seen such a strange operating table before. It looked more like a stretcher, but it had handcuffs and leather straps. Stella's face went pale as she examined all of it with a genuinely terrified expression. I approached the operating table. There were surgical tools lying on it. These tools looked quite different. Scalpels resembled small saws, and there was also a drill. I picked it up and examined it. I told Stella and wondered aloud what this tool was used for. Stella looked at it with frightened eyes and said she didn't think this was a normal hospital. She explained it used to be an asylum. That's why there were leather straps and handcuffs on all the beds in the rooms. Before I could process it, my eyes were drawn to the tip of the drill in my hand. Something dark was dried and speckled on its edge. I shone the light on it and was horrified to realize it looked like dried blood. There was something like a freezer. Stella rushed over and opened it. She started screaming. A horrifying sight lay before us. Inside were numerous jars, emitting a foul stench. They contained ears, noses, and other unidentifiable parts. We couldn't believe our eyes that patients were treated in such grotesque ways. Then I saw one jar. It resembled a model of a human head with its eyes closed. But what happened next still chills me to this day. As we stared at it, it suddenly opened its eyes. We stumbled back, terrified, and began running for our lives. When I looked back, I saw a dark figure chasing us. Sprinting forward, we could hear the screams of hundreds of voices emanating from the asylum, crying out in agony. Stella and I bolted out of the asylum and jumped into the car. Without a second thought, I slammed the gas pedal so hard the car screeched. Somehow, we were lucky to have survived. Stella later researched the abandoned asylum. She discovered that it once housed insane criminals and intellectually disabled individuals, but the doctors running it would often torture them and conduct inhumane experiments on them. After a series of protests, the asylum was shut down, and all records were erased. Locals feared the place, even during the day. They believed the countless souls of the tormented patients still haunted the site. The deadly delivery. Have you ever felt like this might be the moment you die? If not, consider yourself lucky, because that's exactly what happened to me last week. I work at a local pizza shop. My job involves taking orders and delivering pizzas to customers during the night. I've always worked night shifts and never had any issues until last week. I was standing near the counter when the shop phone rang. The man on the line ordered 2 large pizzas and gave an address to a house on the outskirts of town. The man's rude behavior over the phone annoyed me, but I let it slide and started preparing for the delivery. I asked the cook to prepare the order. I checked the address on GPS and realized it would take me 20 minutes to drive there. I was driving through small towns. It was 10 p.m., so the streets were completely deserted. I spotted a house at the end of the street and realized it was the location. I parked near the house and stepped out. The house looked quite abandoned, as if no one lived there. I walked to the front door and knocked. I heard the door creak open after a few seconds. A rough-looking, angry man with a scruffy beard stood in the doorway. His eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of alcohol. He asked, "What do you want?" I realized this was the same guy who had insulted me over the phone. I calmly said, "Here's your pizza," and handed him the boxes. The man eyed me up and down before paying me and slamming the door in my face. I walked back to my car and was about to start the engine when a sound caught my ear. It took me a moment to realize what it was. I strained to listen carefully and realized it was the sobbing of a little girl. I looked around but saw no one. Then I realized the crying was coming from the house I had just delivered the pizzas to. At first, I thought it might be his daughter. It could have been a private family matter, but there was something in the girl's cries, like she was begging me not to leave. I slowly got out of my car and tiptoed closer to the front door, trying to listen to the sounds coming from the house. The girl's sobbing continued, but this time I heard two more voices. I heard two men speaking in hushed tones, their voices raspy, though I could almost make out everything they said. The angry drunk man was yelling at another man, "I told you to shut the girl's mouth tightly." The other man replied, "I did, but she won't stop sobbing." They argued, their voices filled with profanity. The girl's sobbing grew louder. There was a small window on the porch. I slowly peeked inside, and what I saw terrified me. A little girl lay on a dusty mattress on the floor, her hands and feet bound, her mouth taped shut, her wide eyes filled with terror. The entire situation became clear to me. They were kidnappers, and this little girl was their captive. The house was likely abandoned, which is why they chose it as their hideout. I got back into my car, honestly terrified, and thought about just leaving. I figured it was better to let the police handle it, but I realized how dangerous it would be to leave the girl there. So, I called 911. The nearest station said they'd arrive in about 20 minutes. I stepped out and began moving toward the back of the house. When I reached the back door, I saw the two men heading upstairs, leaving the girl on the floor. I told myself this was my only chance. Luckily, the back door had a small pet flap. I reached through and turned the knob. Slowly, the door opened. The men were still arguing upstairs. I quietly made my way into the living room. I reached the girl. At first, she was terrified, but I reassured her, gesturing for silence and whispering that I was there to help her escape. I told her the police were on their way. She nodded tearfully. I started untying her, but suddenly I heard hurried footsteps. It was one of them. I immediately picked the girl up and began running toward the door. The bastard pulled out a large knife and chased us. As I neared the exit, he stabbed me in the leg. I screamed in pain, but I couldn't stop. The girl began crying and screaming in fear when she saw blood pouring from my leg. I held her tightly and ran as fast as I could. The streets were empty, and the next house was far away. I knew I couldn't make it that far. I prayed to God, begging for the police to arrive before they caught us. My hope of survival was slipping as I began to lose consciousness, but then I saw red and blue lights coming toward us. The sound of sirens made me breathe a sigh of relief. I passed out. I spent a week in the hospital. The police reunited the girl with her parents and arrested the kidnappers. The doctor told me I might have a limp for the rest of my life, but when the little girl visited me in the hospital, her smile and the happy tears on her parents' faces made every bit of pain worth it. I was happy to have saved a child's life that night, delivering pizza. The eccentric person on the bus. The cold and quiet night in a small town. Bella often took the bus to get to her workplace. Every day, Bella waited at the same bus stop, quietly watching the world pass by while sipping her coffee. One evening, as usual, she waited for the bus to return home. But there was a man who caught her attention. sending a slight chill down her spine. A man in his 30s, disheveled hair, unshaven, boarded the bus after her. He sat a few rows behind her, but she could feel his eyes on her, though she didn't dare turn around. There was something strange about his presence. Every day on the bus, that man reappeared, always boarding right after her, and his strange behavior began. At first, he walked by and left behind a crude and eerie doll, saying, "This is for you," a gift, before quickly walking away. Bella found it odd and didn't pick it up, ignoring it and moving to another spot out of fear. Sometimes, he would mumble to himself in faint, incomprehensible whispers. Bella grew increasingly uncomfortable, but brushed it off, chalking it up to just an eccentric man. After all, he was just another bus passenger. As days passed without seeing him, she began to feel relieved, thinking she might have overreacted. One evening, Bella sat in her usual spot near the back of the bus. As the bus passed a stop, she saw a familiar figure. She froze, unable to believe her eyes. Then he boarded the bus. She avoided looking at him, pretending not to notice. She sighed in relief as he walked past, but her relief didn't last long as he doubled back and sat right next to her, despite plenty of empty seats around. She didn't dare move. He didn't look directly at Bella, but occasionally glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Then, suddenly, he turned his head toward her, locking eyes with her for a brief moment. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and hollow, sending chills down Bella's spine. At the next stop, he said nothing, simply placed a small piece of paper in her hand and got off the bus immediately, leaving her stunned. Throughout the ride, I didn't dare to open it. When I finally did, curiosity got the better of me. The note read, "I will follow you." Bella's heart raced as she hastily got off the bus. Bella hurriedly stepped off the bus and started walking faster, but then she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, no one was there. As soon as she entered her room, she locked all the doors and pulled the curtains tight, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But then, from the window, she saw his figure lurking at the edge of the road, watching her. She couldn't tell if it was real or just her imagination driven by fear. The next day, Bella took a different route to work, avoiding buses entirely. But paranoia crept in. She began to feel like someone resembling the man from the bus was watching her from alleys, observing her from afar. Then the nightmare struck. A cold hand grabbed her wrist. Startled, she turned around in shock to see him, the man who had been following her from the bus. He gripped her tightly and said in a chilling voice, "You don't need to be scared. I just want to make sure you're safe." Bella was too terrified to think, only desperate to escape. She screamed, "Let me go," but it didn't change anything. His eyes were locked onto hers, unblinking. Luckily, Bella had prepared for the worst. She pulled a can of pepper spray from her pocket and sprayed it into his face, leaving him writhing in pain and temporarily blinded. Terrified, she ran without looking back and collapsed at a small roadside diner nearby, seeking help. He was apprehended shortly after being reported. He confessed that his obsession with Bella stemmed from her uncanny resemblance to his late girlfriend, who had died in a bus accident he couldn't prevent. He was diagnosed with PTSD, and seeing Bella on the bus had triggered his obsession. The man was later admitted to a facility for treatment. Bella, though still haunted by the events, found solace in knowing that the man wasn't truly a threat, but a broken soul lost in his past. But after all, everything had finally come to an end. The Uber driver's nightmare trip. The Uber nightmare, it was just another night on the job. Not that I enjoyed these late shifts, but my rent was due in a week, and I'd already spent all my money on new tires and an oil change. I'd been driving every night. I really hated driving at night. The fog, the isolation, it always gave me chills. I had just dropped off a drunk couple from a bar when my phone buzzed, signaling the next ride. As I drove to pick up my next passenger, I noticed it was the exact spot where I had picked up the couple just half an hour earlier. I figured it was just a strange coincidence. I stopped at the pickup location but didn't see anyone. The fog had thickened, as if swallowing the entire street. I honked the horn and glanced around to see if anyone was coming, but there was no one. I quickly checked my phone to confirm the pickup spot on the app. Just as I was about to double-check the app, my back door suddenly opened, and my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I let out a nervous laugh, even feeling a little embarrassed. It was a man. He didn't say a word as he got in and sat down, clutching a brown paper bag tightly. There was something unsettling about the way he held that bag. After a moment, he told me he knew the couple I had just dropped off. Then, he asked me to take him to the same location where I'd dropped them off earlier. I keyed in the address and started driving. A few miles down the road, my phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped. I got a notification from Uber that someone else wanted to be picked up along the way. It was odd, considering it was past 3 in the morning. I arrived at the new pickup location, and she was standing beneath a streetlight, making her easy to spot. She ran toward the passenger seat, and instinctively, I unlocked the door for her to sit up front. With the man in the back seat, I didn't want to take any chances. I turned away and focused on driving. I glanced at her again. There was something about the way she looked at the man in the back seat, as if they shared a connection, but weren't saying it out loud. We drove in silence. I checked the map. All 3 of them were headed to the same address where I'd dropped off the couple earlier. My mind started racing. What's going on? Why is she going there too? Then I curiously asked, "So, do you all know each other?" She smiled, turned to me, and nodded. "Yes," she said with absolute confidence. When we arrived at the address, I noticed all the lights were off. They began walking toward the house, and before leaving, the woman turned back and said, "Just wait here for a minute. We'll be right back." Both disappeared into the darkness. I stared ahead and sat there for a few minutes, wondering for a moment, should I just leave? Suddenly, there was a loud bang on my car window. She yelled, "Please, hurry, hurry. My friend needs help. We need your help to get her to the hospital." I tried to shake off the fear in my mind and got out of the car to follow her. When we reached the door, the man slammed it shut behind me. He shoved me to the ground, and I saw the knife in his hand. The woman's voice changed, her calm demeanor replaced by a cruel laugh. She slowly turned to me and told me to run while laughing maniacally. I crawled as quickly as I could to the dining room, and I couldn't believe my eyes, the couple I had dropped off an hour ago. But they were no longer alive. The man was now behind me. He was so close. I ran as fast as I could. Luckily, he slipped, giving me just enough time to sprint up the stairs. I wedged myself into a closet, trying to suppress my sobs. I wasn't sure how long I could stay hidden. Then I suddenly realized there was a figure, a woman, standing in front of the closet. Perhaps the blood trail on the floor had given me away. I hesitated, but saw she was alone outside. I took a chance, shoved the door open, and knocked her to the ground. I hurried to the window without hesitation. I smashed the glass, breaking it, and climbed out. Pain shot through my arm, but I ignored it. I couldn't go back. I just ran, got into my car, and drove straight to the police station. My efforts paid off. The next morning, investigators uncovered the full extent of the killer's crimes. Dozens of drivers had been lured to their deaths in the same way I had been. They had used ride-sharing services as a cover, abducting innocent victims one by one, all for their dark purposes. This ruthless duo had evaded capture many times, but not this time. They were arrested. I felt incredibly lucky because, as far as I knew, most people didn't survive. The nightmare, it seemed, had finally ended. The Bloody Delivery. A quiet, secluded suburban neighborhood with winding streets and houses far apart. My name is Nick, and I'm just a pizza delivery guy trying to make a living. Tonight is cold and rainy, the kind of night where windshield wipers have to work overtime. I've been driving these streets for months now, delivering pizzas to people who barely acknowledge me. It's just a job, nothing special. But tonight, I stopped at the same old house. The house that always orders pizza at the strangest hours. It's so remote and isolated. It feels like it belongs to another universe. I've been here so many times I've lost count, but there's always been something off about it. I parked in front of the isolated house at the edge of town, stopping at the end of the gravel driveway, headlights illuminating the crumbling porch. The house looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. Overgrown grass, dusty windows, darkened by old curtains swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizza box, and stepped up to the front door, knocking on the heavy wooden frame that echoed loudly. For a moment, nothing. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her faint smile barely lighting up her pale face, illuminated by dim light from inside. Yet her eyes were distant, unfocused, shadowed. "Here's your pizza," I said cheerfully, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. She reached out for the pizza box, her hand extending. But something about her hand caught my eye. As I handed it to her, I noticed bruises, dark, swollen marks on her pale skin, as if they'd been there for days. I froze for a second, standing there, unsure if I should say something, but decided against it. I quickly withdrew my hand and forced a smile. "Thanks," she mumbled, almost robotic, before pulling the pizza box inside and shutting the door. I got back in my car and sat for a moment, thinking. The rain kept pouring, and the world outside felt heavy. I couldn't shake the image of her trembling hand as she took the pizza box from me. But I drove away, trying to push it out of my mind. It was just a strange coincidence, I told myself. Weeks passed. Same routine. I delivered pizza to the same house every few days. I started to feel uneasy, my curiosity growing. One evening, after handing her the pizza, I hesitated and asked, "Excuse me? May I ask something?" But the woman only smiled faintly, shook her head, and closed the door, leaving me unsettled. Each time, the bruises and scratches on her hands seemed worse, this time even on her face, as if they had just healed and then reappeared. My instincts told me something was very wrong. Tonight, there was no regular order, but then I noticed something strange, a note hastily written in black ink taped to the door. It read, "Deliver to the back door. Knock 3 times, hard." I followed the instructions. This time, it wasn't her but a man. He stood there, bloodshot eyes, clearly intoxicated, his breath reeking of alcohol. He didn't say a word, just glared at me. I instinctively stepped back, trying to keep calm. He reached for the pizza box, snatched it from my hands, stepped inside and slammed the door shut. I left quickly. One evening, I drove past the house again, not to deliver this time, just passing by after my shift. My curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the house. In the second-floor window, a figure appeared behind the curtain, flashing a light 3 times, repeatedly, over and over. But then, I saw the shadow of a man behind her, raising his hand as if ready to strike. I froze for a moment. I sat in my car, unable to take my eyes off the house. Something inside me told me I needed to go back. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't ignore it. She needed help. After some thought, I returned to the house, planning to make up an excuse, saying it was a promotional gift for loyal customers. I felt I needed to see the woman again to make sure she was okay. The woman opened the door to pay, her eyes darting down to her hand as if she was deciding whether to say something. I followed her gaze. Then, her hand slowly moved down in an unusual way. She folded her thumb into her palm, then folded all her fingers down. At first, I didn't understand, but then I remembered learning about warning signals. It was the SOS hand signal for help. Before I could react or ask her what was happening, the man appeared behind her and shoved her back. He was still drunk, stumbling toward me with a dark, menacing expression. This time, his face had a fresh scratch, and his clothes were smeared with something unidentifiable, speckled with tiny dark spots. The man looked disoriented, his bloodshot eyes moving sluggishly. He mumbled something incoherent and slammed the door shut. At that moment, I froze in hesitation, unsure if this was my responsibility and whether I was putting myself in danger. Just as I was about to leave, the woman screamed from inside the house. "Help! Please!" Her voice was filled with fear. I dropped the pizza box, instincts kicking in, and rushed through the door without hesitation, quickly moving into the house. I knew a bit about self-defense. I had trained in martial arts for situations like this. As I stepped inside, a scene of chaos unfolded. It was horrifying. She was pinned to the floor, struggling under the man's weight, her face wet with tears, and her hands partially bound. Before I could move, the man charged at me in a fit of rage. But I anticipated the attack, ducked low, and countered with a strong strike to his side, sending him crashing to the floor in pain. Seizing the moment, I pinned him to the floor and used the rope he was tying the woman with to restrain him temporarily, long enough to keep him away from her. He was arrested shortly after, and the truth behind that house came to light. Her name was Angela. The man was her ex-husband. The two had gone through a court-ordered divorce. After she refused to reconcile with him, he kidnapped and tortured her, planning to force her into submission. His recent behavior was the result of a psychotic episode. His obsession turned deadly when she tried to escape. After the incident, I decided to quit my job, unwilling to continue such a dangerous line of work. Angela is now living a happy life with her daughter and her new husband. The dark truck. Jack Carson, a rough-mannered, long-haul truck driver known for taking jobs no one else wanted, embarked on a long journey down an infamous, desolate road. His truck was tightly sealed, labeled only as medical supplies. The highway stretched endlessly, eerily quiet, with no signs of life except for the occasional rustling of dead trees in the wind. It was the kind of road you only took if you absolutely had to. Jack stopped at a solitary, dilapidated rest area. He stepped out for a smoke, the silence pressing on him like a physical weight. The wind carried faint, eerie whispers. Jack couldn't tell where they came from, but as he looked around, there was no one in sight. As he leaned against the truck, breathing in the air, a soft yet menacing voice whispered in his ear.
"You will die, as I did."
Startled, he turned around, dropping his cigarette, but there was no one there. Just a strange mist swirling outside the window. Shaken, Jack climbed back into the truck and slammed the door shut. He had never experienced anything that felt so real. As soon as he started the engine, the radio turned on with an old, haunting tune. He brushed it off, thinking it was a malfunction. His hands trembled as he turned the knob to silence it, but the static continued, almost as if mocking him. driving down the dark stretch of road. Those words kept echoing in his mind,
You will die as I did.
growing louder with each passing moment. Driving deeper into the night, Jack noticed movement on the roadside. He squinted, unsure of what he was seeing, thinking it might be an animal. But as he got closer, the shapes formed into human figures, standing on the roadside, half hidden in the mist. Some waved cheerfully, but upon closer inspection, their smiles were twisted and maniacal, exuding malicious hatred. Others simply stared, their hollow eyes devoid of life. One figure pressed itself against the windshield, grinning mischievously. Jack held his breath as he slammed on the brakes. The figure vanished as soon as he looked away, leaving only the sound of the truck's tires screeching against the pavement. He gasped for breath, panic rising. What the hell is going on? Jack's eyes darted from side to side, trying to make sense of the shapes in the mist. The highway seemed endless. Jack could feel fatigue setting in. His eyelids grew heavy, and the road stretched on endlessly. He eventually stopped at another rest area, hoping to catch some sleep. Jack leaned back in the cabin, closing his eyes and falling into a deep sleep, the hum of the engine lulling him into a false sense of security. Then Jack woke up with a start. A weight pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. His hands were pinned to the seat, leaving him unable to move. A wailing scream tore through the air, very close, as if it came from right in front of Jack. His eyes shot open wide. A figure, a woman, stood before him, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes milky white and hollow. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Jack tried to scream, but no sound came out, as if the world was closing in on him. And then everything went dark. He jolted awake, gasping for air. The sun was rising as Jack stepped out of the truck, his body trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had tried to take him. The mist had cleared, but the memory of the woman's wailing cry lingered in Jack's mind. Jack returned to the desolate road he had driven 1,000 times before. Tempted by money, he ignored what he had seen before. The thick fog swallowed everything. A figure, barely visible in the mist, darted in front of the truck. Jack swerved, yanking the wheel hard. The truck veered, narrowly missing the faint figure as it lunged toward him. His breath caught in his throat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As the truck wobbled back under control, Jack glanced into the rearview mirror. Nothing, no figure, no movement. Shaking, he took a sip of coffee. The bitter taste did nothing to calm him. It wasn't long before Jack's anxiety turned to sheer terror. Suddenly, an icy chill swept through the cabin, making the hair on his neck stand up. He felt someone sitting beside him. He glanced at the passenger seat. A pale woman with sunken eyes and disheveled black hair, dressed in tattered clothes, sat there in eerie silence. She slowly turned her head to face him, staring intently.
Now it's your turn to pay for the lives you've taken.
Jack gripped the wheel, struggling to keep control of the truck, demanding to know who she was. Then the woman lunged at him, her icy hands tightening around his neck. Jack screamed, but it was choked off. Disoriented, Jack instinctively hit the gas as he struggled to break free from the crushing grip. The truck swerved, its tires screeching on the wet road. Jack's vision blurred, his mind spinning as if he were sinking into darkness. He gripped the wheel with one hand, the other flailing in the air. His fingers passed through her futilely. "Please don't do this." The woman didn't respond, her gaze glowing with a deadly hatred. Jack felt the truck slipping out of control, sliding sideways toward the edge of the road. He tried to hit the brakes, but his legs were numb. Jack's world went black. His body slumped into the seat. The truck careened off the road, the sound of metal scraping against gravel and dirt filling the air until it crashed through the guardrail, plunging into the ravine. The next morning, police investigators arrived at the crash site. The mangled truck lay at the bottom of the ravine, its cargo spilled across the ground. They found Jack's body in the driver's seat, his neck twisted to one side, bruised heavily as if something had crushed it. Investigators and forensic teams began examining the wreckage. Beneath the layers of cargo, they uncovered sealed containers marked with warning labels. Then they uncovered a horrifying truth. Hidden among the legitimate goods were human organs. Jack wasn't just a truck driver. He was a trafficker of human organs, disguised as a legitimate cargo hauler. As the investigation unfolded, it revealed an illicit network that Jack was a part of, operating under protection for years. Many innocent lives had been lost at the hands of these merciless criminals. The ghost of the woman stood at a distance, her purpose fulfilled. For Jack, it was too late. He had no chance to turn back. He had faced the consequences of his actions. The cursed game. The Willis family's house, her neighbors, stood quietly at the end of a dimly lit street. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. Lily, who had done many jobs before, was starting her first day babysitting this time. The cozy living room was scattered with toys. Lily was greeted by Angie, a curious little girl. After listening to the parents' instructions and seeing them leave, the house was left to the two of them, growing silent. Angie leaned forward, her eyes lighting up mischievously.
Let's play a game. Call Mary.
Lily froze, letting out a nervous giggle. Angie tugged on Lily's sleeve, her wide eyes pleading.
Please, Lily. Just this once? I won't ask for anything else.
Lily hesitated, but Angie's persistence made her relent. Angie explained to Lily that they had to go into the bathroom, turn off all the lights, and say her name 3 times in front of the mirror. If they did, Mary would appear. They must not let the candle go out. Lily didn't really believe it and thought it was just a made-up game. The bathroom was dimly lit by flickering candles. Lily stood in front of the mirror. She took a deep breath and said,
All right, just this once.
and they'd go to bed. She called the woman's name. Before she could finish, Angie gasped and backed away, saying she didn't want to play anymore. Lily reassured her, saying it was fine, just a game, and it would end now. Then they'd go back to the room, just as they were about to leave. But then the candles suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness. An icy chill swept over them. Lily led Angie out of the bathroom, but the house lights flickered erratically. From the bathroom, a soft whisper echoed throughout the house. Lily froze. Angie began to tear up and asked her,
What's that sound?
Before Lily could react, a figure, a woman, emerged from the bathroom, her hollow black eyes and mouth oozing a horrifying black sludge. Clutching Angie's hand, she began to step back. Together, they ran and hid in the dining room. Lily tried to turn on the lights, but they didn't work. It was as if they were trapped in another world. Lily pulled Angie under the dining table to hide from the ghost's pursuit. Through the gap beneath the tablecloth, Angie saw her bare feet shuffling closer. The floor creaked with each step. Lily ran to the bathroom. She quickly grabbed the matchbox from her pocket and lit the candles. Her hands trembled as she tried, but the flame refused to catch. It was too late. Behind Lily, she appeared, her distorted smile widening as she raised a pair of scissors. Lily panicked, dropping the matchbox and crawling backward, sobbing as she begged for mercy in vain. When Lily locked eyes with her, she felt pain engulf her entire body. She could do nothing but stare, the feeling worse than death. As the scissors slowly moved toward Lily's body, ready to tear through her skin and claim her life, Lily thought it was over. Then she heard the cry of a child. Suddenly, the lights came back on. Angie stood holding a candle and screamed.
Leave her alone.
Seeing this, Lily chanted her name 3 times to end the game. The candle suddenly flared to life. A piercing scream shook the house as she dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. Angie clung tightly to her.
She's gone, right?
Lily nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the dark bathroom door. The Willis parents returned to find Angie asleep, with every light in the house on. Lily managed a tired smile. That day was Lily's first and last day as a babysitter. She had seen many things in her life, but nothing compared to what happened that night. Even if you don't believe, don't take the risk. The Ghost Train on Christmas Day. It was Christmas Eve, and I was late for my flight. The snow was falling heavier than usual, and the slippery roads turned my usual route to the airport into a nightmare. I had to catch the last train out of town to make it to my flight. Otherwise, I'd be stuck until morning. I arrived at the station just in time to catch the train, which seemed unusually empty for such a busy night. It was an old model, not the kind of train I usually saw at this station. But I didn't have time to think about it. I hurried aboard. As I stepped onto the train, I noticed the conductor. He wasn't the usual friendly face I was accustomed to on my daily commutes. This man was older, gaunt, with tired eyes that made me uneasy. His uniform was dark and worn, as though it hadn't been cleaned in years. The inside of the train was just as strange, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly musty lingering in the air. The train car was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, but the atmosphere was tense, as if something wasn't quite right. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall heavier, blanketing everything outside. The train began to move, and I felt it sway slightly as it picked up speed out of the city. Then I heard the sound of a child crying, just a faint sob. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it echoed faintly again, as if coming from somewhere near the back of the train. I tried to ignore it, but it echoed in my mind. I began to feel increasingly uneasy, glancing around again, but no one else seemed to notice the sound, which only made it worse. Then I saw him, the conductor. I asked him if he heard it. He said, "Not all passengers on this train want to be here, but they cannot leave." To my bewilderment, he walked away immediately. I steadied myself and turned to ask him about what he had just said. But strangely, he was no longer there. I stood up and walked toward the back of the train. My footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached the next car, I froze in place. In the dim light, I could see a shadow. It was a child. He clutched a small, tattered doll in his hands, wearing what looked like outdated, shabby clothes. He didn't move, his head bowed. I asked, "Are you lost?" But there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the train lurched forward, shaking violently. Without thinking, I reached out to steady the boy. The lights stabilized, but the train car was empty, completely deserted. I moved back into the aisle, trying to understand what was happening. The other passengers remained still, staring straight ahead, oblivious to the madness unfolding around them. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grasp my arm, sending a shiver through me. The train shook violently again, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air. The train screeched to a sudden halt, and I stumbled, trying to steady myself. The passengers were gone. The train was empty, except for the boy, standing with his back to me. He didn't move, just stood there with his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for me to do something. The doll in the boy's hand fell to the floor. I slowly approached him, bending instinctively to pick it up. When I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. The boy turned, and his eyes were voids of pitch-black emptiness, locking onto mine. His voice echoed coldly in the air. They left me. I panicked, never having seen anything like this before. Before I could react, the sound of crying turned into an ear-piercing scream, deafening and spine-chilling. I lost my balance and fell backward in fear, my vision spinning as the boy stood still, seemingly unaffected. The train doors suddenly slid open. With trembling hands, I crawled toward the exit, desperately trying to escape. I staggered out into the freezing, eerily silent night. But when I looked back, the train was gone, completely vanished, leaving only an empty, snow-covered platform as if it had never been there. I don't remember how I got home that night. Every Christmas Eve since, I still wonder whether the midnight train was real or just a nightmare. Years later, on another Christmas Eve, I found an old article, a newspaper archive about a train that disappeared in a snowstorm many years ago. The article spoke of a missing child whose parents had abandoned him on that very train. It was said that the Midnight Express appears every Christmas Eve, carrying lost souls who cannot move on. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. I looked out the window. The snow continued to fall outside, and a chill ran down my spine. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights when the air was still, and everything seemed too quiet. The large, sprawling suburban house had a neatly trimmed lawn. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was a paradise for any kid. It had a TV, a pool table, and video games. It was the kind of place where you forgot about everything outside, and we were living the dream. We sprawled out on the big leather couch, watching horror movies on TV and munching on potato chips. Chase had started dozing off. I was wrestling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety. I usually felt sleeping over at a friend's house, but tonight it was different. Much worse. It was probably past midnight when I heard it. A creak as a door slowly opened. I glanced behind the couch and saw something that unnerved me. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. "Chase, wake up." The laundry room door. It opened on its own. Chase, groggy and half asleep, muttered something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted he come with me to close it. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch and fell asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come easily. A little later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a noise that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an incredibly unsettling expression. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed. Chase jerked awake, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the man moving toward us. In a panic, we ran. The basement had two exits. One led upstairs to the front door, and the other was a sliding door to the patio. We split up. I ran toward the patio door while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping, I quickly called the police, blurting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled around the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His screams were desperate, terrified cries for help. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man wrapping his arms around Chase's neck, choking him. His face twisted into a horrific expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face red, struggling to breathe. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the intruder's head. The man collapsed onto the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had been just minutes ago. We stayed silent, too afraid to speak. I peered out the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. I just knew I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly crossing the yard, his movements deliberate, as he headed toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." The two of us backed into a corner of the small treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder, the creak of the ladder. He was climbing. I could feel his weight pressing on the structure as the treehouse swayed slightly with each step. Chase looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox. Chase's dad had left here months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, clutching it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the metal rod down with all my strength. The man let out a cry of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we climbed down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind was racing. Where could we go? And I knew it wouldn't be long before he got back up. Gasping for air, I dragged Chase to the side of the house where thick bushes and overgrown trees obscured us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood there, cautiously peeking out from the bushes. I signaled Chase to follow me. We darted toward the path as the police car stopped. Relief washed over me as two officers got out, immediately surveying the area. I yelled, "He's still there! He's..." Before I could finish, the man stepped out of the shadows, emerging from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more calculated. Blood dripped from the gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept moving toward us, his eyes fixed on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing to walk slowly, cautiously. Then, without warning, he lunged forward with terrifying speed. A gunshot from the officers rang out, tearing through the night. The man staggered, collapsing onto the ground, gasping his last breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. Finally, it seemed like it was really over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter who had been living in abandoned houses around the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found an old, crumpled photograph. It was Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to pick us up. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It was a reminder that true horror doesn't always come from the dark. It can stand right behind you, watching. Betrayal in the dark. It was a quiet night in late October, and I was patrolling the empty streets of our small Texas town. The air carried a heavy, ominous stillness that often lingers in the early hours. Not much happens in our town after midnight, occasionally a bar fight or a stray animal wandering the streets. But that night, around 2:15 a.m., the radio crackled. I received a call. I picked up the radio, and there was a man on the other end. "Officer, please. I think there's someone in my house." I could hear his breathing, rapid and shallow. Then, just as he was about to say something, the line cut off. I tried calling him back, but the call went straight to voicemail. I contacted my colleague to trace the location. I stopped, squinting at the GPS. It was a location just a few streets away, near the edge of town. Something about his voice unsettled me, so I decided to check it out. I arrived at the address, but there was nothing there, just an empty lot. The wind whistled softly, brushing through tall, dry grass. I checked the GPS again. The location was correct, but there was no house, just emptiness. In the distance, a faint light flickered on the porch of a farmhouse. I felt an inexplicable pull. I decided to walk to the farmhouse, thinking perhaps they might know something. I parked and approached the door. I knocked, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. A young man answered. He looked tired, confused, and not at all like someone who had made a desperate phone call. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, squinting at me through the dim light. I explained the call and asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual. He shook his head. I asked if he knew of anyone else living nearby. The man shook his head slowly. "No, sir. There aren't any houses for miles." I thanked him and returned to my car, the unease in my chest growing stronger. I checked the radio again and tried calling the number once more, but it still went straight to voicemail. I decided to head back to the station, but as I turned the key in the ignition, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. There was someone sitting in the back seat. I could only make out a shadow, a hunched figure barely visible in the darkness. My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm, reaching for the radio to call for backup. But before I could, I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head, pain exploding as everything went dark. I woke up dazed, my head throbbing. My hands were tied, and the room smelled of damp wood and rust. A single bulb swung overhead, casting long, jagged shadows. And then I saw him. It was my colleague, Jeff. His face twisted into a maniacal grin, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You didn't expect to see me, did you?" he sneered. "I've been waiting for this," he continued, pacing with a gleaming knife in his hand. "Do you know how long I've had to smile through your success, Brad? While I was stuck with scraps?" He lunged, pressing the knife close to my face. He started taunting me about how I was always calm and how he'd see how calm I'd remain now. The cuts weren't deep, but they stung. Blood trickled down my skin as he mocked me, savoring every moment. I waited, biding my time. His grip on the knife loosened as he got lost in his rage. When he leaned too close, I acted. I kicked his shin with all my strength, making him stumble. My hands were still tied, but I used my shoulder to charge at him, slamming him into the wall. The knife fell to the floor. He was stunned, giving me just enough time to grab the knife with my bound hands. I bolted out of there. Behind me, Jeff staggered out, shouting my name, but his voice faded as I ran toward my patrol car. I stumbled into the police station, bloody but alive. My colleagues rushed to me, their faces a mix of shock and concern. I told them everything. Jeff was arrested. He sat calmly, as if nothing had happened, but his eyes gleamed with malice. Weeks later, I drove past the place where it all began, but now I understood better. Sometimes, the monsters we fear don't hide in the shadows. They stand right next to us, wearing friendly faces. The strange man in the snow. Last winter, I went to a small cabin owned by my uncle in Mountain Valley. I finally reached the cabin after a long 3-hour drive, the tires crunching on the frozen ground. Stepping out of the car, the cold bit through my coat. Almost immediately, A boy around 15 or 16 years old ran out of the cabin. He was young and smiling. His eyes looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. He took my luggage and guided me inside. I stepped inside the cabin. It was simple and rustic. A fireplace stood in the corner, with wood neatly stacked beside it. The boy explained how cold it got at night, his voice unusually calm. I told the boy I would go skiing and asked if he could prepare dinner for me while I was out. He nodded with that strange smile. I dressed in my ski gear, excited to hit the slopes. I began skiing through the forest, where all the trees were bare. Halfway down, snow started falling, thick and fast. I took a break and walked toward a large tree. Suddenly, a faint growl echoed in the air. I froze. Standing next to the tree was a man looking up at the sky, his face covered in falling snowflakes. His neck was unnaturally long, and his shoulders jutted out at odd angles. He didn't move at all. This man was unsettling. I quietly stepped back, avoiding sudden movements so as not to disturb him. I just wanted to get back to the cabin. I stepped cautiously, but accidentally crushed a twig underfoot. A loud snap broke the silence. The man looked down, his eyes glowing like those of a wild animal. Blood was smeared across his mouth, and his right hand clutched a dead rabbit, its belly torn open. The man wiped his mouth with his other hand and smiled wickedly. Panicked and frantic, I bolted through the forest, snow crunching under my boots. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. I quickly locked it. The teenager noticed something was wrong. He came out of the kitchen, and I shouted to call the police immediately. He calmly replied, "There's no service here, sir." I checked my phone, and he was right. There was no signal. "What's going on, sir?" the boy asked. I realized I couldn't tell the boy the truth about the man. I didn't want to scare him. So, I lied and said I had heard wild animals in the forest. After a while, I calmed down, embarrassed by my overreaction. Perhaps I had exaggerated it too much. While having dinner, the lights suddenly went out. A heavy snowstorm had started outside, and I could hear the windows rattling from the fierce wind. I wondered where the boy was and realized I never knew his name. Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching on the snow outside. I slowly turned my head toward the large window. Near the fireplace, the light illuminated a bloodied hand pressed against the outside of the living room window. His bloodied hand was pressed against the glass. It was the man I had seen in the forest. His face was pressed against it, smearing blood across the surface as he grinned, staring directly at me. The man's mouth gaped open, his tongue licking blood around his lips. His unblinking eyes were fixed on me. Then the boy walked in, as if he had been hiding, and looked at the man through the glass. He wasn't scared, he was almost amused. His smile mirrored the man's grin. "That's my father," he said. I froze for a moment, then grabbed the car keys off the wall. I flung open the front door and ran barefoot into the storm. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. The boy's laughter followed me into the night. I hurried to the car, driving for 2 hours, barely able to see through the snowstorm. I didn't stop until I reached the next hotel. Once I was safe, I called my uncle. His answer sent chills down my spine. "What boy? There's no caretaker at the cabin. No one else is supposed to be there." Horrified, I realized I had spent hours in that cabin with complete strangers. The next morning, I reported it to the police. They went with me to the cabin. It was empty. My belongings were gone, and the cabin was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what those people wanted, but I would never stay in an isolated cabin again. Night shift nightmare. Jen was sitting at the dimly lit reception desk, trying to stay awake. She was checking the computer, reviewing her work, when suddenly, she felt someone lightly tap her on the shoulder. Startled, she turned around but found no one there. Worried, she chuckled, dismissing it as fatigue in her imagination. But a few minutes later, she felt a light but distinct tug at her hair. She froze, her hand slowly moving to the back of her head. The vague sensation of fingers lingered, as if someone was right behind her, almost unseen. She suddenly turned around again, but there was nothing. Then a book on the far end of the desk fell to the ground with a loud thud. As she shifted in her chair, Jen jumped. She focused on the book on the floor, the silence enveloping her. She shook her head to clear it and tried to brush it aside. She walked to the break room to collect herself. As she poured coffee into her cup, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if eyes were staring at her from the dark corner of the room. At 3:30 a.m., Jen returned to the lobby, sitting back at her desk, clutching her coffee cup. She checked the security cameras on her computer screen. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. She jumped up, quickly glancing outside through the glass, but only her own reflection stared back. Her hand lingered on the doorknob, uncertain. After a tense few seconds, she unlocked it, cracked it open, and peered outside. The night air was cold and empty. Jen closed the door and returned to her desk. Trying to shake off her fear, Jenna grabbed some cleaning supplies and headed toward the pool area as requested by her manager. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the edge of the pool. Just then, she noticed a faint outline of wet footprints, as if someone had recently walked through. She fearfully brushed past it, ignoring it as if she had never seen it, and continued with her work. She bent down to pick up a few scattered leaves, floating on the surface of the water. At that moment, she felt it, a strange sensation as if a dark shadow was lurking just beneath the surface of the pool. She hurriedly tried to leave, but before she could react, something yanked hard at her ankle, pulling her down into the pool. Jen lost her balance and fell into the cold water, her body soaked. Panicked, she felt as if she were drowning. She began to flail, sputtering water, then staggered out of the pool, trembling and looking around in confusion, not understanding what was happening. Jen struggled against an invisible force, her hands clawing at the pool's edge, but she was held tightly by a weight she couldn't comprehend. Her vision began to fade when she suddenly saw a woman raising a skeletal hand, pointing directly at her, saying something like, "I hate you all," before vanishing. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, Jen summoned her last bit of strength to escape, gasping for air as she surfaced. Hair disheveled and soaked, Jen stammered as she recounted what had happened by the pool to her manager. She tried to explain how real that feeling had been, but her manager merely checked the cameras and remained skeptical. He insisted that perhaps she just slipped. To her, it was different. She knew it was more than just a slip. Back at the reception desk, Jenna sat there exhausted. She felt foolish and paranoid, wondering if her fear was just in her head, fueled by her coworkers' ghost stories. Her gaze scanned the security cameras, but she hesitated, afraid of what she might see. She quickly packed her things, not wanting to spend another minute in the building. Her shift was about to end. Jen walked out suddenly. The doorbell rang softly in the empty lobby. Her eyes glanced toward the hotel. She held her breath as she watched the front door slowly open, revealing darkness inside as if someone was standing there. But she thought it was enough and turned around to leave immediately. As she drove home, Jen realized she would have to return to work the next day. The haunting spirit would be waiting, and the cycle of fear might never end. She needed to confirm this truth. Night shift nightmare. The next day, Jen stood behind the dimly lit reception desk, her hands slightly trembling as she stared at the empty lobby. The memory of the ghostly encounter lingered in her mind, but she pushed it aside, reminding herself that she needed this job. Jen reluctantly walked towards the pool area. The flickering lights cast strange shadows, making the room feel even more frightening. She glanced at the water, fearing the woman would reappear. But the pool remained still, the surface undisturbed. Jen took a deep breath, regaining her composure for the cleaning task ahead. As she began cleaning the pool, Jen's eyes scanned the area. She didn't see the ghost. Instead, her gaze fell upon a room she had almost never noticed before, peeking out from behind a dusty curtain. She stepped inside, her eyes landing on a pile of old papers stored in the corner. Curiosity sparked. She approached and began sifting through the dust-covered documents. Among them, an old article caught her eye. The headline read, "Mysterious Murder at the Hotel. Night Staff Member Missing." The article recounted an incident nearly a year prior, where a woman was brutally murdered by one of the hotel's night staff during a blackout. The next morning, the disfigured body of the woman was found with a flower pinned to her dress, but there was no sign of the staff member responsible for the crime. Jenna's mind raced as she processed this information, piecing together the fragments of a tragic story. Determined to shake off her fear, Jen continued her work. But as she bent down to pick up leaves, she felt someone behind her. She hesitated, fear enveloping her. Standing upright, she glanced around the empty pool area, but saw nothing. Jen continued to finish her cleaning, but once again, she caught sight of a dark shadow on the water. She turned around, but it was too late. The ghost was right behind her. An eerie smile stretched across her distorted face. Jen staggered back, the ghost's laughter echoing in her ears as she was drawn into the pool. The world around her felt like an endless abyss. Jen panicked as she emerged from the water, gasping for air. It stood at the edge of the pool, looking at her with a delighted and smug expression. Soaked and gasping, Jen burst through the door. She headed toward the reception desk, ready to leave the nightmare behind. But as she reached for her bag, she hesitated. She recalled the wronged woman she had seen in the article had also gone missing right there. Could it be her? What if that woman needed her help? The thought lingered, gnawing at her conscience. After much inner turmoil, she decided to return. Upon reaching the pool again, Jen looked around and saw the woman standing at the edge. But then she shouted, "I will help you find him." Jen could see the woman's expression change. She slowly reached out, brushing her icy fingers across Jen's forehead. Images flooded Jen's mind. Flashes of the night of the murder, the struggle, the fear in the woman's eyes. And finally, the face of the night staff, a dim shadow emerging. She returned to the reception desk. Using the hotel's security system, Jen searched for anything unusual, scanning the old footage from that fateful night, but most of it had been nearly erased. However, he missed one scene, him entering through the back door, with small dirt clumps still scattered on the ground. It led to the large abandoned area behind the building. The next day, Jen began searching for hidden evidence. Following the woman's memories, she rummaged through the abandoned land behind the hotel. Jen continued to dig. She discovered broken branches and leftover, but nothing resembling the evidence she sought. She felt like giving up. On the second night, Jen dreamed of the ghost, her distorted face contorted in pain. She was determined to return. After nearly 2 exhausting days, just as despair threatened to consume her, Jen's shovel struck something. She dug deeper, discovering an old box. When she opened it, she found the murder weapon, a knife, and a USB that he had hidden away, intending to destroy it. He seemed to have toyed with the law, disregarding it. Jen hurried to the police station. She presented the evidence she had found. With the evidence in hand, he was identified. After so long, he was finally apprehended. Jen felt the weight lifted off her shoulders. The ghost of the woman appeared behind her, a faint smile on her distorted face. Jen returned, knowing that the woman's soul could finally find peace. She glanced back at the building, but this time she felt it had truly closed. The town's haunted mystery. It was during one of our arguments, moving from yelling to an uncomfortable silence. Kira suggested, almost hesitantly, maybe we just need to leave. Start somewhere new. She stared at the wall, her voice trembling. I thought differently. I didn't believe a change of scenery would solve anything, but despair hung thick in the air between us. We'd gone through endless nonsense for months, arguing over small things like dishes left in the sink or unwashed clothes, which then escalated into intense fights. Our little daughter, Lily, would stand in the corner, clutching her toy, her eyes sad as if she understood more than we realized. The arguments became unbearable, and I felt as though our family was crumbling day by day. The drive to our new town was filled with silence. The sun began to set, casting an orange glow on the horizon as we traded one skyline for endless fields. I cracked the window, breathing in fresh air, feeling a weight lift off my chest. Kira smiled at me, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Eventually, we drove up to our new house. It was a small, cozy old building nestled among others on the street. As we unpacked, I felt a flicker of hope. It was the first time I saw her. Margaret, an elderly woman in a sweater and long skirt, stood on the sidewalk. She waved as she saw us, holding a plate of cookies to welcome us to the neighborhood. As we exchanged pleasantries, I noticed a girl standing behind Margaret, around Lily's age but with a troubling paleness. Then she complimented my daughter. I replied, trying to smile politely, but something about Margaret felt strange. Her enthusiasm was odd. Suddenly, she turned serious, mentioning a certain well. She began to tell me about a wishing well in town, urging me to bring Lily there, assuring me she would love it. A wishing well. I found it rather strange, like a local legend from where I lived. She said it would bring luck to anyone who made a wish and tossed in a coin, a tradition spanning generations. The conversation made me uncomfortable. Kira shrugged, but I felt a chill as I watched Margaret leave, the girl following her like a shadow. In the days that followed, the town felt like a breath of fresh air. The change in atmosphere worked wonders for our family. Kira and I argued less, and Lily seemed to thrive in the open space of our new home. The townsfolk were friendly and laid back. Yet, the well kept coming up in conversation. I overheard a cashier mention it, saying, "The well changed my life." At work, my coworkers talked about it as if it were some sort of miracle. Finally, one night, I mentioned it to Kira, about everyone's obsession with this well. She just thought it was probably one of their local traditions. But the unease grew heavier. The atmosphere at work changed. My hours were cut, and coworkers became distant. It felt like something was pressing down on us, suffocating us. Kira's mood turned dark, and we argued over trivial things again. One night, I was wandering through the forest. I stumbled upon the well. It stood ominously in a clearing, its stone walls oddly slick. I could feel the weight of the town's tradition pulling me back. What if I made a wish? Desperation clawed within me. I approached the well, heart pounding. I had nothing left to lose. I pulled a quarter from my pocket, thinking of my family, of needing things to get better. I tossed the coin in, wishing for things to improve. A silence fell over me as I turned to leave. At that moment, Margaret appeared, her smile wide and unsettling. "You made a wish, didn't you?" I nodded, feeling a mix of hope and dread rising within me. She simply said, "It will come true," and then smiled, walking away. The next morning, I woke up to the familiar warmth in bed. Kira lay beside me, her face peaceful. I glanced around, feeling a weight lift from my chest. I had a strange feeling of hope, as though everything was falling back into place. Breakfast was a cheerful event, laughter filling the room. It felt like the burdens of the past had been lifted. We were happy, almost too happy. But a small part of me felt something wasn't quite right. And everything from that day began that night. While lying in bed, I couldn't escape the feeling of insecurity. Something is wrong. Lily's scream broke the silence, and I rushed to my child's room. Lily trembled, her eyes wide open in fear as she cried and pointed to me that there was a monster in the window. I hurried to the window, pulled back the curtains, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street and the trees. What is happening? I whispered to myself, feeling panic rise within me. I turned back to Lily, who was still staring at the window, pale and terrified. I stood frozen, trying to comfort her in my arms, though the unease gnawed at me. I stayed up late that night, with Lily between Kira and me. Kira, exhausted from sleepless nights, drifted off, leaving me on high alert. The following days were a chaotic mix of anxiety and paranoia. Lily's nightmares became a nightly occurrence, and each time, I found myself jolted awake by her screams. I tried to distract myself with errands around town, but whispers seemed to follow me everywhere I went. The locals had hollow smiles, with something in their eyes I couldn't quite identify. It felt like the whole town was watching me. Everything will be fine, a cheerful cashier said as I bought groceries, but her smile felt like a mask hiding something sinister. Just make a wish by the well. I never wanted this nightmare. I never wanted my family involved in any twisted game. One evening, after another night of Lily's screams, I found myself back at the well, drawn by some force I couldn't understand. The air was tense as I approached, Margaret's words echoing in my mind. As I stood there, I noticed the well's surface glistening under the moonlight, almost inviting me. I leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. The chill of the night air made me shiver. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched washed over me once again. I felt a presence lurking in the darkness, and panic took over. I ran home, my breaths coming fast and shallow. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. Kira was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. I quickly ran to Lily's room to check on her and saw she was fast asleep. But when I looked closer, I noticed a thin layer of sweat on her forehead. Something wasn't right. I went back to Kira, pacing the floor, my mind spinning. We need to do something. This can't keep happening. Kira's gaze was distant, lost in thought. She said to me, "Maybe we should leave. We could pack up and go somewhere else." "No," I snapped stubbornly, feeling the weight of despair. "We can't keep running. We need to find a way to fix this." That night, I decided to confront Margaret. I needed to know the truth. With my heart racing, I left the house and headed to hers. As I approached, the atmosphere changed. I knocked on the door, fear rising within me. She greeted me with a smile that seemed friendly, but it didn't feel genuine at all. I desperately told her I needed to know what was happening. Her expression turned serious, her eyes narrowing. "You know, wishes come with consequences," she said softly. Leaning closer, "You wished for things to be better, but what if there's a cost?" I felt myself unraveling as she kept talking about what I had lost. She tilted her head, that predatory smile returning. "It's not always clear. Sometimes you get what you wish for by sacrificing something else, something precious." I stumbled back, wondering if I had traded my daughter's happiness for a hollow life. When I returned home, I found Lily in her room, but she wasn't the girl I once knew. Laughter seemed to have been replaced by an eerie silence. She looked at me with hollow eyes, like an empty shell. Regret weighed heavily on me. I had wanted to fix everything, but I had only made it worse, foolishly believing in something dark and twisted. I returned to the well, desperate to undo my wish. I knelt by the edge, staring into the darkness. I want my daughter back. I didn't want this to happen, but the well remained silent. Days passed, and our home became like a prison as Lily worsened, her strange behaviors leaving me helpless and heartbroken, unsure of what to do. Every time I went outside, those around me kept smiling, but their eyes hid a secret, a dark truth I could never grasp. They too had made their wishes, and I was just another pawn in their game. In the end, I made a decision. I would play the game, just like Margaret had. I would find another family and make them wish, too, to replace my daughter. As I walked through the town, I spotted a family moving in down the street, a young couple with a little girl who looked just like Lily. I approached them, a smile spreading across my face. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, hiding the darkness within. And no, with a new cast in the pipeline. Maybe the darkness had clouded my vision and taken over. I didn't know when this would end or if there was any escape. The girl looked up, her eyes bright and full of life, unaware of the fate that awaited her. Perhaps I had to be the villain, to save my daughter, my family. The Ghostly Tome. An old library stood at the edge of town, a structure with stone walls darkened by centuries of weather. Ivy covered the walls, and narrow arched windows allowed only the faintest. This was where Clara worked as the head librarian, a job she had cherished for over a decade. She always found solace in the silence, the smell of old books. But something had changed. Clara arrived early and approached the heavy wooden door. As she unlocked it, a shiver came over her, a feeling she had been experiencing more often lately. She took it as the cold of the morning and went inside. The library was still and silent, as usual at this hour. Clara moved through the familiar aisles, her footsteps echoing softly. She followed her routine, checking book returns and organizing new arrivals. The building's silence was comforting, yet today it felt oppressive, almost watchful. She made her way to the basement, where the rare and old books were stored. It was her favorite part of the library, but for some reason, they were often not taken out for reading. The basement was the coldest part of the library, and as Clara descended the creaky wooden stairs, she felt a growing sense of unease. The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Shadows danced across the walls, and the musty smell of old paper was stronger here. She was searching for a book that a researcher had requested from her library. As she searched, she heard a faint rustling sound behind her. She quickly turned around, but saw nothing. She told herself it was just a rat. Clara continued her search. Finally, she found the book she was looking for, an old leather-bound tome with faded gold lettering. As she pulled it from the shelf, she felt a sudden, icy breeze brush past her. The lights flickered, and she heard the rustling again, louder this time, as if something was moving through the stacks. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the book to her chest. She decided it was time to leave the basement. As she turned to go, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, darker than the others, passed between the bookshelves. She stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. A shadow that had the vague shape of a human being. The shadow stopped, forming a vaguely human-like shape that seemed to be looking straight at her, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. She stumbled up the stairs, nearly dropping the book in her haste. Panic struck. Clara struggled to find the flashlight, but her hands were shaking so much that she couldn't turn it on. The rustling sound grew louder, closer, until she felt it right next to her. Clara felt something cold and wet touch her arm, and she screamed. At that moment, she dropped the book, revealing pages filled with strange, unfamiliar symbols. Reluctantly took the book back, feeling an inexplicable pull to take it with me. In the darkness, as she brought the book upstairs, Clara could feel its presence. It seemed to seep into her mind, filling her with fear. As she neared the basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening noise. The library above seemed unchanged, still and silent, but the claustrophobic feeling remained. Back in the main lobby, Clara sat at her desk, a mysterious book in front of her. She placed the book on the table and took a breath, then stared at it with both fear and curiosity. She started to wonder whether she should open it or not, but then she curiously opened it to examine the symbols, flipping through each page, brittle with age. The symbols seemed to shift and change, almost as if they were alive. She shook her head, blaming her imagination. And thinking she was being paranoid. Darkness filled the library. She suddenly read a passage out loud. Suddenly, the whispering became louder. The lights flickered violently, then went out completely. Clara's breathing became rapid. She tried to ignore it, closed the book immediately, and decided to put it back in its place. The library was silent and dark. Clara, she doesn't know if she's in her imagination, or if something is residing in this library, or if there are hidden secrets that she doesn't know yet. Morning light cast long shadows through narrow windows. Clara stood outside, hesitating to enter. She gathered her courage, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Clara slowly walked toward her desk, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. As she passed by, she glimpsed the old book she had stored in the basement yesterday lying on her desk. Clara was horrified. She was certain she'd put it back on the shelf in the basement. Clara stared at the book, hesitated for a moment, then grabbed it, deciding to destroy it in hopes of freeing herself from this fear. She walked toward the old fireplace at the far end of the library, gripping the book tightly. She opened it, and the symbols writhed as if alive, almost resisting her. She threw the book into the flames. A hissing sound escaped from the book. The fire abruptly went out, extinguished, leaving the book charred but still intact. Clara stared at the ancient book, desperate. She raised the book to throw it into the trash. But as she swung her arm, an invisible force pulled it from her hand. The book flew across the room, hovering mid-air. Then it started flying back, hurtling toward her with fierce speed. It slammed into her chest, knocking the wind out of her in pain. She gasped, stumbling backward, clutching her aching ribs. She held her breath, watching the book fall to the floor, its pages flapping wildly. Clara's hands trembled as she picked up the book again, and from the corner of her eye, she sensed someone standing and watching her. At that moment, everything seemed to go dark. Turning slowly, she found herself face to face with a shadowy figure from her nightmares. She lifted her phone flashlight to see. The figure moved slowly into the faint light, revealing the distorted, grotesque shape of a woman. Her skin was pale, stretched tightly over sharp, angular bones. Her face was gaunt, with only skeletal features. Her mouth twisted into a crooked smile, revealing jagged, decayed teeth. Her eyes were black, hollow, and lifeless. Clara stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her hand. The grotesque woman moved closer, her jerky movements almost puppet-like. Then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged toward her, its twisted, skeletal hand stretching out, distorting as it reached for her. Its claw-like fingers scratched across Clara's face as if devouring a meal. Clara raised the book defensively, trying to fend it off, but the spirit lunged at her again. With its unnaturally elongated arm, it grabbed her shoulder once again, pulling her closer. Pain tore through her, as if her skin was being ripped apart. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The woman's face came closer, her distorted smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing layers of rotting flesh inside her mouth. She stared into the ghost's endless, empty black eyes. The book slipped from her hand. The book's pages began to flip wildly, symbols blazing with dark energy, as if absorbing the terror flooding the room. In a final attempt to escape, Clara crawled backward, away from it, but it floated after her, laughing loudly, piercingly. Clara's vision dimmed as her strength drained away, her body paralyzed, her mind succumbing to the encroaching darkness. The library stood eerily silent, pale light cast on the dark stone walls. Villagers gathered, whispering to each other as they noticed Clara's absence. The library doors remained shut, and though a few dared to peer through the windows, they saw only empty, silent rooms with no sign of Clara. The whispers lingered, awaiting the next unfortunate soul to uncover the library's secrets. Rain pounded against the windshield as I drove down a deserted highway, my headlights barely piercing through the torrential downpour. I was a solitary traveler, accustomed to nights like this, navigating strange roads in search of new experiences. As I saw a sign emerge from the darkness, "Welcome to Cottage City," a wave of relief washed over me. Shelter was near. I pressed on, hoping the town would offer some respite from the storm. I drove slowly through the quiet streets. The town felt almost frozen in time. One house caught my eye, a crumbling structure by the roadside, abandoned and eerie. The walls were spray, painted with words like "Keep Out, Demon," and "Don't Look Back." Wooden crosses were haphazardly nailed to the porch and gate, as if someone was trying to ward off something within. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over and stepped out into the rain, turning on my flashlight. I stood outside, the light catching the faded words, and when I shone the beam toward the house, I froze. In the upstairs window, a boy stood staring down at me. His face was pale, with dark circles under his red, swollen eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't move, just gazed at me with an empty stare. I shivered and called out, "Hey, are you here alone, boy? Do you need help?" I mentioned that I was looking for a place to stay. The boy tilted his head, his expression unchanged, but his gaze seemed to pierce through me, questioning why I was there and suggesting I shouldn't be in this place. He began to speak. "Are you here to meet her?" It was an odd question, one that filled me with dread. I thought this place was abandoned. I asked why he was here alone and where she was. Then, inexplicably, he broke into a strange smile and told me, "Her? She's waiting for a replacement." His gaze shifted to something behind me, his expression turning to one of horror. A strong wind blew through, rattling the doors of the old house. Then suddenly, a hand touched me from behind. I turned around to see a creepy old man standing behind me with a lantern, his bewildered face wondering why I was standing in front of this abandoned house. I stammered, explaining that I was just a traveler, seeking shelter from the storm. I told him about the boy I had seen in the window, but he insisted that I must have imagined it, even though I knew what I had seen. I learned that the nearest hotel was still an hour's drive away, and he told me that if I wanted, I could stay overnight at his house. He made me feel strange, yet I accepted his invitation. It was hard to fathom that the boy I had seen in the abandoned house was just my imagination, but something told me this man knew more than he let on. The old man's house looked as ancient as its exterior. The furniture was old, the walls covered with dusty bookshelves and faded photographs. He led me to a seat by the fireplace. Finally, I mustered the courage to ask him about the house. He told me that many years ago, he moved here with his father. There weren't many children in the neighborhood, so he quickly made friends with a boy named Roland. Roland's family was large and boisterous, always filled with laughter. Roland's aunt, a warm woman, always had candy for the children, especially for him. But one day, she passed away suddenly. The whole family was grief-stricken, everyone except Roland. He didn't shed a single tear, didn't say a word. He just stood at her funeral, frozen and silent, his eyes vacant even as they lowered her into the ground. He had changed since that day, hardly going outside and spending hours alone in his room. Ronald was always in his room with his Ouija board. He used to say his aunt had taught him to use it, and Ronald would sit for hours trying to communicate with her. As he continued his story, I could almost visualize the events unfolding. Something had shifted in him that day, something dark and frightening. Then he continued telling me about what the boy had gone through since that day. Right after his aunt passed away, frightening things started happening in that house. At midnight, Roland's mother began hearing strange noises coming from his room at night, scratching sounds, like fingernails scraping the walls. Roland lay awake, eyes wide open, staring at something in the darkness. He felt a presence, something lurking beside his bed, watching him. Henry leaned forward. He told me how Roland had confided in his older friend, saying he felt eyes watching him every night as it stood at the edge of his bed, silent but terrifying. The next morning, Roland's mother checked his bed and found scratch marks on the mattress. And more than that, his mother found them on Roland's own skin. Roland would scream, sometimes laugh loudly in the middle of the night. His voice changed, becoming rough, distorted, and pained. Roland's mother would rush in, only to find him alone, trembling, his eyes filled with fear. He told her about them, strange, shadowy figures. They all gathered around his bed, staring with their hollow mouths open in a silent scream. They all thought Roland was different. Everyone knew something was invading him, but no one could stop it or help him. I shuddered as the old man recounted the family's desperate decision to call for an exorcism. Roland's family called in priests to perform an exorcism. Father Raymond was among them, placing a cross under Roland's pillow, hoping to drive out whatever haunted the house. The ritual began, Latin whispers filling the room. The exorcism became chaotic. Roland writhed on the bed, growling like an animal as if the cross caused him unbearable pain. Furniture flew across the room, and the cross seemed to burn him, driving him into a violent rage. Latin phrases poured from his mouth, mixed with a raspy laugh. His body twisted in unnatural ways, his eyes staring at something invisible. Father Raymond performed many exorcisms on Roland, and he endured immense pain. During the exorcisms, he would roll and vomit, spit, speak in Latin, then laugh uncontrollably. His voice was like a demon from the depths. Once, during an exorcism, Roland suddenly broke free from the priest's grip and lunged at the metal bed frame. He swung it wildly, striking a priest's arm, forcing them to halt the exorcism. On the night of the final exorcism, words appeared on Roland's body as if someone invisible was carving them with a sharp knife. On the final night, 3 priests performed Roland's last exorcism, even witnessing his body levitating. When they recited the final incantation, Roland's body fell motionless onto the bed. Everyone believed he was cured. Roland's family moved away soon after, and no one ever saw him again. Neighbors avoided the house, cursing it. Some families even moved away due to strange occurrences. He told me that some believe Roland's spirit never left, that he's still trapped in that house. I shuddered, recalling the boy in the window grinning at me. his eyes dark and hollow. I told the old man what I'd seen. Hesitating, as I said the boy looked no older than 14. The old man nodded slowly, saying that was Roland's exact age when he vanished. I was stunned by what I'd heard. The old man pointed to a small room under the stairs, suggesting I sleep there. He warned me again to stay away from the exorcised house, then went upstairs. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake, unable to shake the image of the boy from my mind. I wondered what would have happened if he hadn't come. Could I have been the next, just as the boy had said? The sun finally rose, and the memory of the night clung to me like a shadow. I thanked Henry and left, but the questions remained. Did Roland die during the exorcism? His soul trapped forever, or had something darker consumed him? But one thing was certain, I would never return to Cottage City again. Dark intentions at Dunkin' Donut. The fluorescent lights flicker above me as I sit on the edge of a narrow bed. The cold walls, the air thick with dust and time. It's been 2 years, but I remember it all as if it happened yesterday. The Dunkin' Donuts shop, the rain, and Jerry. That's where it all began. I worked the night shift at the Dunkin' Donuts in a quiet suburban town. It was a small place, nestled between an old laundromat and a thrift store. I saved what I could, putting money aside each night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job, and it kept me going. My sister usually stopped by, but tonight she wasn't there to see me. She was sitting by the window with a guy, her eyes red from crying. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was obvious they were arguing. She looked so distressed. He wore an old, worn coat, lingering at the door, watching the place. Tonight, he hesitated at the door, lingering longer than usual. I tried to keep my distance. There was something about him that made my skin crawl. I snapped out of my thoughts when the door creaked open, and Jerry walked in. He was irregular but always so strange. His habit of coming in at exactly 10 p.m. never failed. He shuffled to the counter, but his gaze shifted to my sister, now sitting alone, staring out the window. Jerry leaned in, asking me about her, asking if he could get her number. I clenched my jaw, trying to smile politely, but the sharpness in my voice slipped out. "Leave her alone, Jerry. Just order and go." He chuckled and said, all right, I'll have the usual." He ordered a chocolate donut and hot chocolate, which he always ordered, and went to his usual seat in the corner. I watched him eat, tearing tiny pieces off his donut, his eyes flicking toward me now and then, making me uneasy. My shift ended. It was pouring as I walked home, the streets deserted, but after a few blocks, I started hearing another set of footsteps, echoing mine, stopping when I stopped. I turned around, but no one was there, just the empty sidewalk stretching under the streetlights. I kept walking, faster, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I finally made it back to my apartment. I went into my bedroom, letting the silence envelop me. But then I saw him, Jerry, standing across the street, holding a radio. He just stood there, staring at me, the radio pressed to his ear. He pressed his head to it, then suddenly smashed it against his head with a blank, puzzled expression. Blood gushed from his head. I scrambled around the room for my phone to get help, but when I looked back, he was gone. I sat on my bed, staring out the window into the rainy night. Jerry's face kept flashing in my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I was sick of seeing him every night. And then, a dark thought crept into my mind, and I felt an odd satisfaction as I imagined it unfolding. I needed to teach him a lesson, to make him understand he wasn't welcome. The next night, I returned to the shop, stopping at the back to grab some supplies. I picked up a box of donuts, carefully selecting a chocolate one, just like Jerry's usual order. I pulled a small vial from my pocket, a stimulant strong enough to paralyze him for a while. I injected it into the donut, the liquid vanishing into the soft pastry. I carefully placed the donut back in the box, my heart racing as I imagined Jerry's face when he realized what was happening. I returned home and watched the rain fall outside the window. The donut sat on the dresser, a reminder of the plan forming in my head. As I sat there, an odd sense of peace washed over me. I didn't know where this road would lead, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't have to see Jerry's face staring at me anymore. Wouldn't have to endure his unsettling presence lurking on the edges of my life. The next night, I returned to the counter, watching the quiet stream of customers come and go, my mind racing with the plan I had laid out. The donut box sat in the drawer, hidden away, with one specific donut prepared for Jerry. I spent the whole day thinking about it, rehearsing the moment in my mind, imagining his face when he realized what I had done. I checked the clock. Almost 10 p.m. The door opened, and Jerry walked in, moving with his usual unsettling calm. I noticed a new scar on his forehead, a reminder of his strange behavior the night before. He glanced at the menu, but his focus was entirely on me. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash, throwing it directly at my face. I could feel my anger boiling inside from his action. I reached into the drawer and pulled out the box with the special donut inside. I took him to the table, keeping my face as neutral as possible. He accepted it with a smirk. Then I went back to waiting for what I wanted. I stood still, watching Jerry slowly move his hand to the plate and take out the donut I had prepared for him. He slowly picked it up and intended to enjoy it. I felt very satisfied and happy to be able to witness what was about to happen. I chuckled inside. But then suddenly his hand holding the cake stopped. He put it on the plate and looked away. My heart sank with disappointment. Then I saw the door open again. That's my sister. She was smiling, dressed a little more neatly than usual. When she approached the counter, then turned her eyes to Jerry, her face lit up. I stared in disbelief, piecing everything together as she looked over to his desk. Could it be that what I'm thinking right now is true? My sister said, her voice filled with excitement, "Adam, I want you to meet someone," and pointed to the table where Jerry was sitting. My sister went to his table. Then he started to act gallantly. I suddenly remembered that she also liked to eat chocolate cake. Then, with a distorted smile, he brought the cake to his mouth for my sister to eat. I felt like I was collapsing, and instead a surge of panic hit me. I ran to the table and stumbled, screaming in vain, "Stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking with desperation. Panic flooded the room as I knelt beside her, screaming, shaking her, hoping she'd wake up. Jerry knelt down too, his face showing real horror as he tried to help. He pressed down, trying CPR, but it was no use. She was unconscious, her face pale. That's when it hit me, had I misjudged him all along? I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed for an ambulance, my mind reeling as I realized the gravity of what I had done. The ambulance arrived, and I followed as they loaded her into the back, the siren wailing as they sped toward the hospital. The waiting room was cold, sterile, and I sat there, numb, staring at the wall, my mind racing with guilt, fear, and regret. A doctor came out, his face grim. He told me she was alive, but barely. The drug I put in the donut was enough to paralyze her temporarily, but very dangerous. She might not walk again. If there had been more, she wouldn't have survived. Relief washed over me for only a brief moment before I saw the police step into the waiting room, their eyes fixed on me. They approached, and I could feel the weight of what was about to happen. The room was harshly lit, cold, and unwelcoming. They asked me questions, again and again, trying to piece together what had happened. I told them the truth, every detail, from Jerry's strange behavior to the plan I had laid out, unaware of the devastating consequences. The officer listened and told me I was lucky my sister was still alive. But I should not be mistaken. This was premeditated, and I would face the consequences. With the camera evidence and the plots I had schemed, I was now convicted, the weight of my actions bearing down on me as I was led away. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door through the cold prison bars. The world seemed distant, but the memories of that night never left me. I wondered about my sister, hoping she had healed, hoping she had moved on, and maybe, someday, she would forgive me. Ghost in the gym. A violent storm raged outside, the rain pattering against the windows of the gym. Today, Nana arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the upcoming exam, hurrying toward the gym. Her gym teacher greeted each student outside the girls' locker room, as usual. Nana entered the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly due to the storm. She walked to her locker and took out her workout clothes. As she began preparing her things, a faint shadow caught her eye, gliding along the other side of the lockers. She paused, glancing around. Curiosity overcame her, and she called out, "Is anyone there?" Nana walked toward the source of the noise, which was at the end of the locker room, where a row of shower stalls stood, the last stall covered by a thick, dark curtain. Nana approached, the lights beginning to flicker erratically. Not knowing where she found the courage, she reached out and pulled back the closed curtain, revealing only an empty shower stall. She was about to turn away when she sensed someone passing right behind her. She froze for a moment, then a sound like soft sobbing echoed back, sending chills down her spine. The temperature suddenly dropped, a chill enveloping her. At that moment, the voices of other girls echoed in from the hallway. Nana temporarily felt relieved as she stepped out of the shower area and saw a group of students walking by. She asked if they heard someone crying, but the girls exchanged puzzled glances and shook their heads. She returned to the gym class, where everyone was gathered. Suddenly, a terrified scream echoed throughout the gym. A fellow student named Lee ran in, her face pale and filled with fear. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The gym class fell silent as everyone stared in horror, confused and frightened. As the teacher pressed Lee to explain, she trembled, describing a horrifying scene she told of a baby, covered in blood, appearing in the bathroom and standing there crying. After class, Nana decided to stay behind for extra practice. She walked alone to the entrance when she suddenly noticed a key lying on the floor and the gym door ajar. A dark sense of unease washed over her as Nana stepped into the dimly lit room. She tried to turn on the lights, but they seemed to be out of order. Determined to push past her fear, Nana decided to prepare for the upcoming swimming exam. She walked to the pool area, the dim lights reflecting off the water. As she approached the pool, she heard a nearby sobbing voice, that of a girl, weak and sorrowful. Nana stopped, looking around the area, but saw no one, and everything fell silent. The overhead lights flickered, distorting her vision for a moment. As she squinted, she saw a shadow floating at the far end of the pool. Her first thought was that it was a student practicing diving, as that occasionally happened. But as time passed, she realized that the shadow wasn't moving. A sense of unease welled up inside her, and she decided to check, just to be sure. Nana approached the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the floating shadow. As she got closer, fear surged within her. The water around the shadow began to darken, turning a deep crimson, and she realized with horror that a lifeless body was floating in the pool. Overcome with fear, Nana ran to seek help. Moments later, The police arrived to investigate. They confirmed that the body belonged to a student who had been seen alive just a day before. Nana suddenly realized it was Lee. Her mind was haunted by memories of her friend. She learned that her friend had been haunted by strange visions, driven mad by sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. Lee could not stand the pressure from many sides. It caused her to develop depression and pushed her to the brink. Nana stood at the school gate, watching the flickering lights of police cars fade into the distance. The storm had passed, but a chilling emptiness lingered in the air. She shuddered, haunted by thoughts of the ghostly figure and the cries she had heard. In the following days, Nana lay in bed, tossing and turning as she recalled haunting images. The pale face of her friend Lee, the bloody child, and the dark water lingered ominously in her mind. In her sleep, the voices of Lee echoed in her ears, pleading, desperate, and faint. With each passing day, they grew louder, resonating in her mind. The next morning, Nana walked through the school hallway, the world around her feeling dreamlike. She paused in front of the gym, staring at the closed doors before walking away. That night, Nana fell asleep. As she closed her eyes, she was pulled into another nightmare. She stood in the gym, surrounded by darkness. Lee's face appeared before her, eyes wide with fear as she reached out, as if wanting to say something. Then everything seemed to change. The water in the pool turned red, and she watched in horror as Lee emerged from beneath the surface, slowly rising as if trapped. Nana tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The next day, Nana's nightmare still haunted her thoughts. Each day was filled with a nagging feeling that she was overlooking something urgent, something dark that only she could confront. She knew she needed to understand what had happened to Lee to help her find peace. Nana dove into research, sifting through old-school records, searching for any information about unexplained incidents at the gym or pool. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon a small article about a tragic incident, the unsolved death of a young girl at the school many years ago. The report detailed how a female student mysteriously drowned in the pool, and witnesses claimed to have seen a crying child nearby, although no child was ever found. Through the faded articles and forgotten records, she discovered that a child had been abandoned at the school. The child had died under tragic circumstances, perhaps explaining why the girl's spirit wandered, trapped here. The more she read, the more Nana understood the connection. The spirit of the abandoned child, full of pain and loneliness, had latched onto isolated students. Lee had been haunted by this spirit, drawn in by her own sorrow. That night, Nana returned to the pool one last time, determined to confront the spirit and free her friend. The water's surface was unusually still, almost holding its breath. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, the ghostly form of a child, her wet hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale, hollow face. The child's eyes were dark and empty, locking onto Nana with a sharp, calculating gaze, as if probing her intentions. Nana opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but the child moved closer. Suddenly, the child's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a cruel smile. She reached out with her bony, skeletal hand, extending sharp fingers towards Nana like claws. Nana stepped back, fear rising in her stomach, but she held her ground. She could only follow her heart, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, I want to help you." To the child's spirit, the child's smile faded, her expression stiffening, as if she had heard these words before, words that ended in betrayal. The child's empty eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward, her hands clawing at Nana's throat. Nana stumbled back, but she stood her ground, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want to hurt you. I understand your pain." The child paused, her arms falling to her sides, confusion evident on her face. But then her expression twisted again, suspicion flickering across her features, as if she were battling memories of her own pain and betrayal. In desperation, Nana moved closer, her hand shaking but steady as she extended it. The child hesitated, her appearance wavering between anger and sadness, her expression softening as Nana's words seemed to touch something deep inside. For the first time, the child's expression softened into one of almost peacefulness, her anger dissipating as she released her grip, her form fading into a gentle light. After all, there was one more thing Nana had to do. In her dream, she remembered something that Lee had conveyed to her. Nana recalled being led by Lee to a forgotten corner of the locker room, where an old art portfolio lay hidden beneath a pile of sports equipment, covered in dust. When she was alive, whenever under pressure, Lee would paint vibrant children's paintings, cheerful expressions, and serene landscapes. Each painting was filled with warmth, completely contrasting the darkness that enveloped Lee in her final days. The following weekend, Nana went to the local orphanage, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She handed it to the director of the orphanage, explaining Lee's wishes. As she had promised, Nana had painted and written about their story to memorialize them, ensuring that no one would forget them. Nana returns to school. She reflects on her journey. The remaining echoes of the past have faded, replaced by a feeling of fulfillment. She has somehow helped bring peace to suffering souls. The truck driver's scary encounter. The night was quiet, and I was out making overnight deliveries. Miles of open road stretched before me. I glanced at the clock. It was around 2:00 a.m. I decided to stop at a truck stop to refuel and use the restroom, knowing I wouldn't have another chance for quite a while. The truck stop was deserted, except for a few empty trailers parked nearby. I filled up my tank, breathed in the fresh night air, and then headed to the restroom. The stillness was unsettling, a strange quiet that made me feel restless. With a full tank, I climbed back into the truck, heading toward a stretch of road that would take me through dense woods. It was a long, desolate road, flanked by trees on either side, with no towns, no lights, just the road and the dark forest. An hour later, I was deep in the woods, half awake and half asleep, when something caught my attention ahead. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but as I got closer, I realized there was a figure standing at the roadside. The figure was motionless, just standing there, neither waving nor calling for help. They simply watched me pass by, their face a lifeless, emotionless mask. The figure faded into the darkness behind me as I continued driving, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind. About a mile later, I spotted another figure. This time, it was a woman. She stood at the roadside, wearing ripped jeans and a red sweatshirt. As I approached, our eyes met, and a wave of fear washed over me. She didn't move, didn't gesture. She simply stared, her gaze cold and unblinking. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of her as she turned her head to watch my truck go by. Her eyes locked onto mine through the glass. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to shake off the fear and keep going. I turned my attention back to the road, and my heart nearly stopped. Lying in the middle of the road was a body, sprawled out, arms and legs wide. I slammed on the brakes, the weight of the truck lurching forward as I came to a sudden stop. My mind raced as I stared at the figure lying in the road. I couldn't tell if they were dead or alive, but they were completely motionless. There were no signs of an accident, no debris, no skid marks, just this body, as if they had simply lain down in the middle of the road. I felt the need to go outside to check on them. The forest loomed on both sides, dense and dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I slowly maneuvered the truck around the body lying in the road, my heart pounding, my mind swirling with doubt. Maybe I should stop and check, just to make sure they were okay. I parked the truck a short distance away, and reluctantly, I stepped outside, but there was something about the way they were lying. I was almost there when a horrifying realization struck me. The body was no longer lying on the ground. It was standing upright, staring directly at me with empty, soulless eyes. That figure took a step forward, his movements jerky. Perhaps that was when I realized I had been lured into a trap. I turned to run back to the truck, but the figure lunged forward, moving quickly, intent on hunting me. I had no choice but to flee into the woods. Then I stumbled and fell hard to the ground. A sharp pain shot through my ankle as I tried to get up, but that figure had come closer, a malicious look on their face. I grabbed a fairly large broken branch and held it out in front of me as he slowly approached with a sinister smile. I fought back with everything I had, but he was very strong, moved quickly, and was brutal. When he kicked me in the hip, I staggered backward. I thought everything was over, but a loud explosion echoed through the trees. I followed his gaze and saw a hunter standing nearby, his rifle aimed directly at my attacker. Under the dim moonlight, the hunter's tough and determined face pulled the trigger. The attacker staggered back, clutching his shoulder, dazed for a moment. The attacker staggered, trying to flee, but he was no match for the hunter. The hunter quickly seized him, easily subduing him. He started pulling out his phone and calling the police. I fell to the ground, relief and exhaustion washing over me at the same time. Soon, the flashing lights of police cars cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest. Officers approached, weapons drawn, securing the area as they took my statement. A few days later, I learned the police's conclusion. They called me into the station for a statement and some information. I found out that the man I had encountered, the one lying in the road, was not a stranger to the area. They identified him as a notorious criminal, wanted for a series of highway robberies targeting truck drivers. He and his accomplices planned and staged fake accidents to lure drivers out of their vehicles. They would lie in wait in the woods, ready to ambush anyone who fell into their trap. The strange encounters I had with the figures by the roadside were all part of their twisted game, a psychological tactic to unsettle and confuse victims before the final act. Thanks to the intervention of the hunter and the swift response of the police, they tracked down the criminals and apprehended him. With him now facing serious charges, I knew he wouldn't be lurking in the shadows, preying on unsuspecting people any longer. Stalkers in the dark. I started working as a security guard, night shifting at a small shopping mall in the city right after graduating high school. This job was supposed to be simple. Sit in front of the screen, watch people come and go, and occasionally handle shoplifters or suspicious behavior. But the truth is, the nights can be long, even boring. Until Black Friday arrived in the month leading up to Halloween. I had heard stories about the chaos, people acting as if they were clawing to get the best deals. It was madness, pushing and shoving like a zombie apocalypse. This year, I was scheduled for the dreaded Black Friday shift. It was my second year, and I thought I knew what to expect. What I didn't expect was the note. When I arrived for my shift that evening, I found a note waiting for me on my desk, right in front of the row of CCTV monitors. It simply read, "If you're in the dark, stay indoors." It was puzzling, and I had no idea who it was meant for or what it referred to. I felt a bit uneasy but brushed it off. Maybe it was a prank or something the cleaning crew accidentally left behind. I didn't want to dwell on it and focused on my job. As soon as the mall opened, chaos ensued. People pushed and shoved, scrambling for discounted items. Every walkie-talkie on the team was buzzing non-stop. We had 10 security guards on duty, and it still wasn't enough to manage the madness. Late in the evening, things calmed down a bit until I received a call over the radio. A group of men was reportedly mugging someone with a knife in the third-floor parking lot. I quickly decided to check the cameras to see what I was getting into. As I unlocked the door and swung it open, I nearly bumped into someone. There was a strange man sitting inside. He was standing in front of the screen, wearing a red and green Christmas outfit. His head turned toward the monitor, making me freeze. He slowly turned his face toward me, a pair of sunglasses covering his eyes, even though the room was pitch black. Before I could say a word, he stepped closer, his face just inches from mine, flashing a toothy grin, sharp teeth like a shark's. Did you get my note? I reached for the walkie-talkie, but before I could do anything, the lights in the room went out, plunging us into complete darkness. I raised my hands, bracing for him to lunge at me, but instead, I felt nothing. I shone the flashlight, and he had vanished, leaving the room empty with just me standing there. I tried to calm myself and refocus on my pressing duties. The dimly lit corridors of the mall were filled with strange decorations, shadows, and the faint echo of creepy sound effects coming from the nearby costume shop. As I walked around, I noticed something strange. A life-sized mannequin in the costume shop window. It was dressed in an outfit identical to that of the strange man. I turned to look behind me as I heard a noise coming from behind, glancing through the shop's glass. The mannequin was no longer inside. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard a raspy laugh behind me. I turned around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and there he was, the man, grinning horrifically and then lunging toward me. I stumbled back, narrowly dodging him. I weaved between the aisles and ran up the escalator, my heart pounding as I tried to put as much distance as possible between us. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the security room and slammed the door shut, locking it tight behind me. I quickly accessed the camera feeds, searching for any sign of the man. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the screens, but I couldn't find him anywhere. Then, on one of the feeds, I saw him standing in the hallway just outside the security room, staring directly into the camera. A sinister smile plastered across his face, waving at me. I grabbed the walkie again, calling for backup, but the signal was distorted. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. I hurriedly fumbled for my flashlight. A creaking sound like claws scraping the door echoed. I braced myself, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, as the door swung open and he stepped inside, laughing mockingly at my fear. I remembered the emergency lever behind the desk. Without hesitation, I rushed over, pulling it down just as he reached for me. He lunged at me, and we got caught in a struggle. He was stronger than he looked, his hands clawing at me as I tried to push him away. We slammed into the metal shelves, the impact echoing throughout the room. I pulled the walkie from my belt, calling for backup again. My voice trembled with tension, but I just hoped someone would hear me. After a tense struggle, I pushed him away one last time, and he staggered. This time, I seized the opportunity, quickly grabbing a metal rod nearby and locking it against the door, trapping him inside. I quickly called for assistance. I stood guard at the door, listening to his screams from the other side. Within minutes, 2 officers ran down the hallway, guns drawn. They reached me, and I unlocked the door, stepping back as they stormed in. I watched as they put him into the police car. his eyes still fixed on me until the very last moment. Back in the security room, I sat down, exhausted but relieved. I scrolled through the camera feeds, carefully checking each one. Then on the feed from the costume shop, I noticed something odd. A new mannequin, dressed in the same outfit, stood in the display window. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the screen. It was just a mannequin, right? As I looked, a shadow moved behind it, just a flicker, barely visible. My hand hovered over the controls, but I shook my head to clear my thoughts. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks after a long night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for me out there to confront it. The cruise ship in room 105. 2 years ago, after days of hard work, I treated myself to a vacation. I had booked my holiday on a cruise ship, and my room was in cabin 105. I was informed that my cabin had bunk beds, so I would have to share the cabin with someone else. It was a bit inconvenient, but I thought it wouldn't be a problem. When I arrived, his belongings were there, a suitcase and a few clothes scattered around, but I didn't see him anywhere. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the cabin was a musty smell in the air. The room was cold, abnormally cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I brushed it aside, thinking it was just the sea air coming in through the vents. That night, I fell asleep in the bottom bunk, exhausted from the day's activities. I expected my roommate to return at any moment, but as I drifted off, the cabin remained quiet. At some point after midnight, I was jolted awake by a gentle noise from above. The top bunk creaked as if someone was shifting, and I assumed my roommate had finally returned and gone to bed. But then, I heard the noise again, a metallic clink. My eyes flew open. It was too dark to see anything, but I could hear footsteps moving toward the cabin door. A moment later, suddenly the door creaked open slowly, and I heard footsteps running down the hallway. Confused, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Had my roommate come in and left without saying a word? The door remained ajar, gently swaying as the ship rocked with the waves. I got out of bed, walked over, and closed the door, the cold draft from the hallway sending chills down my spine. I looked up at the top bunk, the curtain drawn. The figure I had heard was gone, but there was something unsettling about the way the curtain hung, almost as if someone or something was still there, hiding behind it. When I woke up the next morning, the ship was gently swaying on the waves, but the cabin was freezing. The window was wide open, and the musty smell was worse than ever. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn, and my roommate was nowhere to be found. I hadn't heard a single sound or voice from him. I decided to talk to a staff member about the discomfort of the cabin. His name was Nicky. I began explaining the cold, the foul smell, and the strange occurrences from the night. He listened, but as soon as I mentioned cabin 105, his expression changed. He asked me with a pale face if I was in cabin 105. I answered, confused by his reaction, and asked what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. Then, in a low voice, leaning in and whispering, "There's something wrong with that cabin. Every passenger who's ever stayed there has disappeared. They all fell overboard. No one knows why. We're not allowed to talk about it. They say it's cursed." Having said that, he quickly left, leaving me standing there, stunned in shock. That night, I returned to the cabin, trying to suppress my fear. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn tight, and the air was colder than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I hadn't seen my roommate since I arrived. I decided to pull the curtain back to see for myself. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I slowly pulled it back, hoping to find nothing. And indeed, there was nothing there, just an empty bed. The smell of the sea was now stronger, pungent and overwhelming. I could almost taste the salt on my tongue. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept in. The room plunged into darkness as the flickering lights finally went out. My heart raced in my chest, and I heard it again. The sound. It was the sound of gentle footsteps again, but this time, they didn't come from the hallway. They came from the top bunk. I turned around just as I heard the creak that seemed to echo throughout the room. My blood ran cold. I could barely make out the shape of something moving beneath the blanket on the top bunk, writhing like a mass, and I could see the blanket suddenly swell oddly as if something was growing underneath it. I stepped back in fear as a pale, dripping hand slid out from beneath the blanket. It wasn't a human hand. It was swollen, grayish, the fingers puffy and twisted. The smell of rotting seaweed filled the air. I screamed, bolting out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the deck. The cold night air hit me, and I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. But when I looked up, the sight before me left me breathless. There, on the deck, was the shadow of a man. His body was pale and bloated, his clothes tattered and soaked. His hollow eyes stared at me, empty and soulless. I ran to one of the ship's staff, desperate to tell him what had happened. He listened, his expression serious, as he quietly said, "Cabin 105. I've heard the stories, but no one has ever seen what you have." He suggested that after his shift, he would come to the room with me to prove there was a reasonable explanation. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. The ship was full, and there was nowhere else for me to stay. He and I sat in the cabin, the door locked. We searched the room from top to bottom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We had a glass of whiskey, trying to ease my tension. He began to tell me that the first time this happened was a month ago. The man in that cabin had issues. He had escaped from a mental hospital and booked a ticket for this cruise. They said he jumped overboard to end it all. But every passenger since then has seen something. Just then, as Nikki spoke, the window latch began to slowly turn, as if someone were on the other side. His face paled as the window opened on its own. The smell of the sea flooded the room, and the lights flickered once more. Something moved on the top bunk. Nikki stood up, eyes wide in fear at something on the bed. I turned around, my heart pounding. There, on the top bunk, was the figure of a pale, bloated man, soaked in seawater. His lifeless eyes stared down at us as he reached out his hand. Nikki rushed toward the door, but it was too late. The figure leaped off the bed, its cold, wet hands wrapping around his throat. He screamed, trying to break free, but it was too strong. It tightened, choking the life out of him. I grabbed the cross around my neck and held it up. It let out a scream of terror and released him, turning its deadly white eyes towards me. With one last desperate push, I flung the door open, and the figure rushed through, disappearing into the dark hallway. The figure seemed to dissolve into the night, its body sinking into the dark waters below. We stood on the deck, gasping for breath, the horror of what just happened sinking in. By morning, after witnessing everything, they had sealed off cabin 105. No one was allowed inside anymore. The ship continued its journey, but the horror lingered. Cabin 105 was cursed, and whatever haunted it would never truly disappear. The troublemaker at Starbucks. Lai had just graduated from college and found a temporary job, which left her struggling to find a place to live. Lai rented a small apartment near a Starbucks, where she worked as a barista. Starbucks was a hangout spot for local musicians and artists, the kind of crowd who knew their coffee. It stayed open until midnight, sometimes even later on weekends. Lai worked the night shift, a shift most employees weren't fond of. The pay was decent, though not great, but the shifts were quiet. However, there was always something unsettling about the empty cafe late at night, especially toward closing time. She spent most of her time cleaning and making coffee to keep herself busy. Nick, a friend of Lai's, would sometimes drop by to keep her company. He knew everyone who worked there. But one summer night, everything changed. Nick wasn't there that evening. He didn't show up because he was attending a friend's wedding, leaving Lai to face the night shift alone. By midnight, she had made only $10 in tips, and the store was almost entirely empty. But she felt grateful that she didn't have to deal with any difficult customers. She went to the back room to fill the mop bucket and started cleaning the floor. The silence was peaceful, but something felt off. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow pass by the front window. Lai glanced up, but no one was there. She called out, asking if anyone was there, thinking a customer had come in through the back door, but there was no response. After a moment of hesitation, she shrugged, thinking she had imagined it, and went back to cleaning behind the counter. Suddenly, she heard the bathroom door open. Lai's heart started pounding, and she felt uneasy. She hadn't seen anyone come in, and the store had been completely empty just minutes before. To her surprise, Nick walked out of the bathroom. A wave of relief washed over her, and she smiled, calling out,
Nick, what are you doing here?
He grinned back at her, saying he had just dropped by after the wedding, but something in his expression had changed. His usual friendly demeanor had turned into something unsettling. She gave an awkward smile, brushing off the strange feeling, and offered him a drink. As she started making an espresso, Lai glanced at him. He was staring at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. Lai tried to act normal and asked him what he was up to. Nick didn't respond. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a USB drive. His smile widened as he tossed it onto the counter. She stared at it, confused, asking what it was. Nick leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. He said he had recorded something Lai wouldn't want anyone else to see. She didn't understand what he was talking about. He stood up straight, crossing his arms. Nick threatened her about some private conversations she had with her boss. Panic started to rise in her, and she yelled that he was lying. Nick shook his head, his smile never fading. Her mind raced, trying to figure out if he was lying, but the confidence in his voice made it clear that he wasn't. He chuckled softly, stepping closer. He spoke to Lai with crude words. He had initially planned to blackmail her, but now he didn't need to, and he thought it was time for Lai to show some appreciation for all the nights he'd kept her company. A nauseating feeling rose in Lai's throat as she realized what he was implying. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest, screaming that he was insane and that she hadn't done anything. Nick's smile turned sinister. Her hands trembled, barely able to breathe as she tried to figure out how to escape. The store was closed, and the doors were locked. She was alone with him, and he was moving in, ready to corner her. She backed away and pleaded with him. His expression darkened, saying he had spent too much time helping without getting anything in return. He reached behind his back and pulled out a knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. She glanced around the room, desperately searching for a way to escape. Her eyes landed on the espresso machine, and an idea formed in her mind. Lai tried to stall him and suggested making him a cup of coffee first. Nick raised an eyebrow but didn't object. She hurried behind the counter, her hands trembling as she poured an espresso. Her heart raced as she reached for the panini press. Without warning, Lai grabbed it and swung it at Nick's head with all her strength. The metal struck the side of his skull, and he staggered back, dropping the knife. Blood trickled down his face, and he let out a groan of pain. But the blow wasn't enough to bring him down. She needed to act fast. Lai ran around the counter, her eyes fixed on Nick as he wiped the blood from his face and started moving toward her. She frantically scanned the room for another weapon or an escape. Nick moved slowly, deliberately, as if he knew Lai had nowhere to run. His smile had vanished, replaced by a grim expression. She backed up toward the rear of the cafe, her mind racing to come up with a plan. The mop bucket was still near the back door. If only she could reach it. With trembling hands, she lunged for the mop bucket, grabbed the metal handle and swung it at him. Nick dodged the first blow, but she swung again, striking him in the ribs. He groaned in pain, stumbling backward. She didn't stop. She swung again, this time aiming for his legs. It sent Nick crashing to the ground with a pained yell, clutching his knee. She seized the opportunity and ran for the back door. Lai fumbled with the lock as Nick struggled to get up. She finally managed to open the door and dashed out into the alley behind the store. She kept running, too afraid to look back as she heard Nick's footsteps behind her. He was limping, but he was still chasing her. Lai rounded a corner and spotted a large metal dumpster near the end of the alley. She crouched behind it, holding her breath. Her heart was pounding so fast it felt like it might burst out of her chest. From her hiding spot, she heard Nick stumble into the alley. His breathing was heavy, labored from the pain, and then his bitter voice called out, asking where she was, saying it wasn't over yet. Lai covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stay as silent as possible, not daring to move. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound, the wail of sirens in the distance. Maybe someone had heard the commotion and called the police. Nick began limping back toward the Starbucks, his footsteps growing fainter as he disappeared into the night. Her legs were shaking so much, she could barely stand. She knew she had to leave before he came back. As she stumbled onto the street, she saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. Lai felt a wave of relief and waved for help. A short time later, Lai was brought to the interrogation room at the police station. The officers came in and told her that Nick had been arrested. He had been hiding in the cafe, trying to erase the security footage. The relief was immense. It was finally over. Nick had been arrested, and the evidence against him was undeniable. He would be charged with multiple crimes, including assault and attempted blackmail. The nightmare was over, and Nick would pay for everything he had done.